Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've never told this story to anyone outside my old unit. Not sure why I'm sharing it now, but after almost 20 years, I still think about that night at Fort Stewart and get goosebumps. It was spring of 2002, and I was a captain with the 3rd Infantry Division. We were doing a massive NTC prep exercise before our scheduled rotation to the National Training Center. For those unfamiliar with military training, NTC is basically the Super Bowl of Army training. Massive force-on-force exercises in the California desert. The prep for it is almost as grueling as the real thing. My platoon and I had been in the field for about 3 weeks at this point. We were filthy, exhausted, and running on fumes. The kind of tired where your eyeballs feel like they're made of sandpaper. We'd been separated from our company during a movement earlier that day. Nothing dramatic, just the usual confusion that happens during these exercises. Radios weren't working right, coordination was off, and before we knew it, we were on our own. By late afternoon, we needed to cross Highway 144 to link back up with our company, but when we got there, MPs had set up a checkpoint and weren't letting anyone through. Something about a civilian convoy scheduled to move through, or some administrative bullshit. They told us we'd have to wait until morning. I was pissed, but there wasn't much I could do. So we found a small clearing just inside the tree line on the southeast side of the highway. It was about 30 meters in from the road, just enough to give us some cover without being too deep in the woods. I remember the area distinctly because there was this massive, twisted oak tree at the edge of the clearing. Looked ancient, with branches that reminded me of arthritic fingers. I should have made everyone set up a proper defensive position, but honestly, these guys were beyond exhausted. Some had been up for almost 48 hours straight, so I made a command decision that probably wasn't by the book. I told everyone to just get some rest. Half the platoon would pull security, while the other half slept, and we'd switch every 4 hours. Most of the guys just climbed up on their vehicles. We had 3 Bradleys and 2 M113 APCs and crashed right there. Some even left the rear ramps down on the vehicles, which is a huge tactical no-no, but at that point, I just needed them to get some sleep. It wasn't like we were in actual combat. It must have been around midnight when things got weird. I was sitting with my platoon sergeant, Staff Sergeant Diaz, under that gnarled oak tree. We were talking quietly, just bullshitting about how much we missed real food and hot showers. The night was clear but moonless, and the stars were incredibly bright. The Georgia woods around us were alive with the usual nighttime sounds. Crickets, frogs, the occasional rustle of small animals. That's when we heard it. I've spent 20 years in the military. I've been to Iraq and Afghanistan. I've heard all kinds of terrible sounds, explosions, gunfire, wounded men screaming. Nothing, and I mean nothing, has ever come close to what we heard that night. It came from about 50 yards into the dense tree line beyond our clearing. A scream. But calling it just a scream doesn't do it justice. It was like someone had recorded a woman's terrified shriek, slowed it down, and then played it through some kind of distortion filter, but in real life. It didn't rise and fall like a normal human scream. It just erupted all at once. This raw, feral sound that hit you like a physical force and then cut off suddenly, like someone had flipped a switch. My blood turned to ice. I'm not being dramatic. I literally felt cold all over. Diaz and I both froze mid-conversation. I remember looking at him, and even in the darkness, I could see his eyes were wide, his face slack with shock. My first instinct was to grab my weapon and head toward the sound. Someone could be hurt, right? But as I started to rise, Diaz grabbed my sleeve. He just gave this subtle shake of his head. No words, and somehow I understood completely. Whatever made that sound, we wanted nothing to do with it. What happened next still haunts me more than the scream itself. Within seconds, and I mean literally seconds, our entire platoon reacted. But here's the thing. Nobody shouted orders. Nobody asked what that sound was. Nobody even spoke. It was like everyone instantly knew exactly what to do. Soldiers who had been dead asleep moments before were suddenly wide awake, sliding down from their vehicles. The guys who'd been on security were already moving. Without a single word being exchanged, multiple vehicle engines started up simultaneously. Ramps that had been left down were being pulled up and sealed. Everyone was getting inside the vehicles, battening down hatches, closing doors. It was the most coordinated thing I've ever seen my platoon do, and we'd never drilled for anything like this. There was no panic, no confusion, just this silent collective understanding that something dangerous was nearby, and we needed to shelter now. I found myself moving toward the nearest Bradley without even making a conscious decision to do so. Diaz was right beside me. We climbed in, sealed the hatch, and sat there in the dim red interior lights, listening to the engine idle. The clearing fell into this eerie silence, broken only by the low hum of 5 vehicle engines and the occasional metallic thunk of someone securing something inside one of the other vehicles. Nobody used the radio to ask what was going on. Nobody stuck their head out to check. We all just waited. I remember looking at my watch. It was 12:17 a.m. At 12:23, I will never forget the exact time, we heard it again. The same ungodly scream, but closer now, maybe 30 yards from our position. My gunner, Specialist Wilson, was sitting in his seat, his hands white-knuckled on the controls, even though the weapon systems weren't powered up. He didn't look at me, but I heard him whisper, "What the fuck is that, sir?" I didn't answer because I had no idea. Nothing in my military training had prepared me for this. Then the scratching started. At first it was so faint I thought I was imagining it, like fingernails lightly dragging across metal. It seemed to move from vehicle to vehicle. First the Bradley to our left, then one of the M113s, then ours. I could feel it more than hear it. A vibration through the hull of the vehicle, traveling up through my boots and into my spine. The 4 of us inside that Bradley, me, Diaz, Wilson, and our driver, Rodriguez, sat in complete silence, barely breathing. The scratching continued for what felt like forever, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. Then it stopped. For the next hour, nothing happened. No more screams, no more scratching. Just the sound of our engines and the occasional creak of metal as the vehicles cooled in the night air. Nobody suggested powering down or getting out. We all seemed to understand that we needed to stay put until daylight. Around 2 a.m., the radio suddenly crackled to life. It was the battalion TOC, Tactical Operations Center, calling for a status update. I responded as calmly as I could, saying we were holding position and would move at first light. The radio operator acknowledged and signed off. Nobody mentioned any strange sounds or incidents. That brief radio exchange seemed to break some of the tension. Rodriguez whispered something about needing to take a leak, but nobody moved to open the hatch. We all just sat there, taking turns dozing in our uncomfortable positions, waiting for dawn. When the first grey light of morning finally appeared, I cautiously opened the top hatch and peered out. The clearing looked exactly as it had the night before. No signs of disturbance, no footprints, nothing unusual. The other vehicles began opening up too, and soldiers emerged looking tired and confused, like they weren't quite sure what had happened. As senior officer, I should have gathered everyone and debriefed the situation, asked what they'd heard, what they'd felt. But something stopped me. It was the looks on their faces, this mixture of relief and silent agreement that whatever had happened during the night was something we weren't going to discuss. The MPs showed up around 7 a.m. to tell us the road was clear. We moved out immediately, rejoining our company later that morning. The day continued like any other training day. Missions, objectives, the usual military routine. Not once did anyone officially mention what had happened. Not in our after-action reviews, not in casual conversation. It was like we all silently agreed to pretend it never occurred. But here's the thing. I know it wasn't just me. Every single person in that platoon reacted to that sound. Every single one of us felt that presence, whatever it was. A few weeks later, I was having a beer with Diaz off post when he suddenly said, "You ever look into the history of that part of Fort Stewart?" I knew exactly what he was talking about without him having to specify. "No," I said. "Should I?" He just shrugged and changed the subject. I did look it up later, though. Fort Stewart was built on land that was once plantation country. Before that, it was Native American territory, Creek and Cherokee mostly. The area has a dark history of violence going back centuries. I don't believe in ghosts or monsters, at least I didn't before that night. But I've replayed those hours in my mind thousands of times, trying to find a rational explanation for what we heard and how we all reacted in such perfect, silent unison. Was it some kind of animal? A panther, maybe, or a fox? I've listened to recordings of their calls, and nothing comes close to what we heard. Was it some kind of mass hallucination brought on by exhaustion? That doesn't explain the scratching I felt through the hull of that Bradley. The thing that still bothers me most, all these years later, is the instantaneous collective response from my entire platoon. How did everyone know exactly what to do without a single word being spoken? It was like some primal instinct kicked in simultaneously for all of us. Some ancient, hardwired response to a threat our modern minds couldn't comprehend, but our bodies somehow recognized. I left the army in 2008 and haven't spoken to most of those men since. Sometimes I wonder if they remember that night the way I do, or if they've managed to convince themselves it was just another weird night in the field. All I know is that something was in those Georgia woods with us, something that made a sound no human or animal should be able to make, and whatever it was hunting. Story 2. I never believed in monsters. I'm not talking about the human kind. I know those exist. I'm talking about the ones that supposedly lurk in the woods, the creatures that make up campfire stories. I'd roll my eyes whenever my husband would watch those Bigfoot hunting shows, but that was before last summer. Now I keep all my windows locked at night. I don't go outside after dark, not anymore. It happened in August of 2022. We live in a rural area outside Somerset, Kentucky. Our property backs up to a pretty big stretch of woods with a reservoir about a half-mile away. It's beautiful country, cornfields, fruit trees, lots of deer. We actually put food scraps out for them sometimes. They'd come right up to the edge of our yard in broad daylight. I used to love watching them from our deck. That night was hot, probably in the mid-80s, even though it was around 2 in the morning. I had the bedroom window open with just the screen in place to catch any hint of a breeze. My husband, Jeff, was away on an overnight work trip, and I was having trouble sleeping without him there. The cats were locked up in the storage shed for the night like usual. We keep their food out there too, to avoid attracting raccoons to the house. I was just drifting off when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just a raccoon or maybe a possum trying to get into the trash cans. But this was different. It was purposeful, powerful. Something was pulling and yanking at the doors of our storage shed. There was scratching too, not like an animal's claws, but like someone or something trying to pry the doors apart. My heart was immediately hammering in my chest. Jeff wasn't home. My phone was charging in the kitchen. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away. I was alone. The pulling and yanking continued, getting more aggressive. Whatever was out there really wanted to get into that shed. I thought about our cats inside and felt sick with worry. I slid out of bed and crouched below my open window, my hands shaking. The moonlight was bright enough that I could see the yard and the shed clearly. What I saw next made my blood run cold. There was something standing at the shed doors. Not a person, Not any animal I'd ever seen before. It was standing upright on two legs, about 4 or 5 feet tall. The whole thing was covered in black hair or fur, and though it wasn't huge, it looked powerful, all muscle and purpose. I could see it had wedged its thumb between the shed doors and was using its other fingers to try to pry them open. The way it moved was so deliberate, so intelligent. This wasn't a bear or a raccoon. This was something that knew exactly what it was doing. As I watched, frozen in terror, it turned its head slightly, glancing over its shoulder in my direction. It didn't fully turn around, but I got the distinct impression it knew I was there. It knew I was watching, but it kept working at those doors like getting into that shed was worth the risk of being spotted. I needed to see better. I needed to know what the hell was in my backyard. As quietly as possible, I crept through the house to the back door that opens onto our deck. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely turn the knob. I eased the door open and flipped on the porch light. The instant the light came on, the creature spun toward me. Its eyes caught the light and reflected back at me, wide, yellow, and glowing like some kind of demon. We locked eyes for maybe 2 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. I'll never forget those eyes as long as I live. Then it bolted. It moved so fast I could barely track it. In just a few massive strides, it crossed our entire yard and disappeared into the overgrown field at the edge of our property. What struck me was how silently it moved. Something that size should have made noise running through tall grass. But there was nothing. Just the sight of its left arm swinging backward as it ran, longer than any human arm should be. I slammed the door shut and locked it. Then I locked every door and window in the house. I grabbed my phone and sat with my back against the wall in the hallway, the most central part of the house, away from all windows. I called Jeff, but it went to voicemail. I was too terrified to call the police. What would I even say? There was a monster trying to break into my shed. They'd think I was crazy or drunk. I sat there until sunrise, jumping at every little sound. When the first light of dawn filtered through the windows, I finally worked up the courage to look outside. Everything seemed normal. The shed doors were still closed. There were no obvious signs of what I'd seen. When Jeff got home around noon, I told him everything. To his credit, he didn't dismiss me or laugh it off. He went out to check the shed. The cats were fine, though they seemed unusually skittish. Jeff found scratch marks around the door handle, but nothing conclusive. Could have been there for ages. I couldn't stop thinking about those yellow eyes. Later, I realized the porch. Light we have is one of those yellow bug lights, which probably caused the yellow reflection I saw. But that doesn't explain what the creature was, or why it was trying to get into our shed. A few days later, Jeff convinced me to report what happened. Some investigators who look into wildlife encounters came out to the property. They were respectful, didn't treat me like I was crazy. We did a reenactment where I showed them exactly where I was and where the creature had been. Based on the height of the shed, they confirmed what I'd seen was around 4 to 5 feet tall. Jeff mentioned to them how we keep the cats and their food in the shed at night. They thought that might have attracted whatever it was. They also noted how we put food out for deer and how wildlife-rich our property is. The reservoir nearby provides water, the woods provide cover, our garden and fruit trees provide food. It's like a perfect habitat for something that wants to stay hidden. They searched for tracks but didn't find anything conclusive. The ground was too dry and hard. They set up some trail cameras, but nothing unusual has shown up on them, at least not yet. It's been almost a year now and I haven't seen the creature again, but I'm changed forever. I keep thinking about how it looked over its shoulder at me while it was trying to break into the shed. It knew I was watching. It was aware, intelligent. That's what terrifies me the most. I don't leave windows open anymore, not even on the hottest nights. I've installed motion sensor lights all around the property. I don't go outside after dark without Jeff, and even then, I'm constantly looking over my shoulder. The investigators told me there have been other reports in the area over the years. Nothing exactly like what I saw, but similar enough to make me wonder. They said the description I gave doesn't match any known animal species in Kentucky. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was just a bear standing on its hind legs. Or maybe some kind of escaped exotic pet. But then I remember those eyes looking directly into mine. The purposeful way it was trying to open that shed. How it ran on two legs, faster than any human could move. I never believed in monsters before. I thought people who claimed to see Bigfoot or whatever were just attention seekers or had mistaken normal animals for something else. Now I don't know what to believe. All I know is what I saw, and it wasn't anything that's supposed to exist in our world. Just last week, Jeff found some unusual prints at the edge of our property where it meets the field. They were like human footprints, but wider, with what looked like claw marks at the tips. The wildlife investigators came back out, but couldn't make casts because it had rained and the prints were too degraded. Part of me hopes they find evidence of whatever this thing is. Another part of me hopes they never do. Because if they confirm something like that is real, is living in these woods, how would anyone ever feel safe again? I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, thinking I hear scratching at the doors or windows. I lie there in the dark, straining to listen, wondering if it's come back, wondering if next time it might try to get into more than just our shed. Story 3. I've always struggled with sleep. My whole life, I've been the last one to fall asleep and the first one to wake up. Most nights, I just lie there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through everything and nothing at the same time. My wife says I should see a doctor about it, but I've gotten used to functioning on 4 or 5 hours of broken sleep. It's just how I'm wired. Back in '98, we took a family camping trip to Surry County, Virginia. It was supposed to be a nice getaway. My wife, our 2 kids, 10 and 8 at the time, and our retriever, Buddy. We'd been planning it for months. I grew up camping with my dad and brother all over Oregon and California, so I wanted to give my kids the same experiences, teach them about nature, fishing, all that good stuff. We set up at this campground not far from the James River. It wasn't anything fancy. Just a cleared area with designated spots for tents, a communal bathroom, and some fire pits. The weather was perfect that May weekend, not too hot yet, but warm enough that we didn't need heavy sleeping bags. The first problem was our neighbors, some college-age kids about 3 sites over who were clearly there to party, not appreciate nature. They were loud, drinking, playing music, laughing at jokes that apparently needed to be shouted rather than spoken. I'm not trying to sound like some grumpy old man, but when you're trying to give your kids a wilderness experience, the last thing you want is to hear Sweet Home Alabama blasting for the 15th time. My wife and kids managed to fall asleep despite the noise. I lay there in our tent, checking my watch every so often, wondering how long these kids could keep going. Around 3 in the morning, they finally quieted down. I remember feeling that wave of relief when silence finally settled over the campground. Just the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant sound of the river, and the soft breathing of my family. I closed my eyes, hoping sleep would finally come, but that's when the entire atmosphere of the place changed. It's hard to explain, but about 15 minutes after those kids quieted down, I noticed how unnaturally silent everything had become. No crickets, no frogs, no rustling in the underbrush. If you've spent any time outdoors, you know nature is never completely quiet, especially near water. But suddenly, it was like someone had hit mute on the whole forest. Then I heard it. From somewhere in the direction of the river, maybe half a mile away, came this sound. I still struggle to describe it accurately. It wasn't a howl exactly, and it wasn't a scream, but some horrifying combination of both. It started low, almost like a moan, then quickly rose in pitch until it became this wailing sound that made the hair on my arms stand up. It lasted maybe 15 seconds, then stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the sound itself. I sat up in my sleeping bag, fully alert now. Buddy, who had been sleeping at the foot of our air mattress, raised his head and let out a low growl. His ears were perked forward, and I could see the tension in his body even in the dim light. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to my wife, but she was still sound asleep, mouth slightly open, completely unaware. I reached for my flashlight and checked my watch. 3:22 in the morning. I wondered if maybe it was just some drunk college kid from the neighboring campsite messing around. But something in my gut told me this wasn't human. The sound had too much resonance to it, like it came from something with a much larger chest cavity than a person has. I waited, barely breathing, straining my ears. About 7 minutes later, it came again. The same mournful wail, starting low and rising to a pitch that felt like it was drilling into my skull. This time, I could tell it was coming from the same direction, still about the same distance away. Buddy growled again, a bit louder this time, and I put my hand on his back to calm him. I didn't want him barking and waking everyone up. My mind started racing through possibilities. Bear? No. Bears don't make sounds like that. Mountain lion? Maybe. But it didn't sound like any cougar I'd ever heard, and I'd heard plenty growing up in the Pacific Northwest. Some kind of bird. No way. This was too powerful, too deliberate. The third call came about 3 minutes after the second one. Same pattern, low to high, but this one was louder, closer, maybe a quarter mile away now. That's when real fear started to set in. Whatever was making this sound was moving in our direction. I carefully slipped out of the sleeping bag, trying not to wake my wife or kids. I reached under the air mattress where I'd stashed my 12-gauge shotgun. I always bring it camping, more for peace of mind than anything else. I'd never had to use it before, but I was damn glad I had it now. The fourth call came about 10 minutes later, even louder. Maybe only a few hundred yards away now. It had a different quality to it, more urgent, almost searching. Buddy was fully alert now, sitting up, a continuous low growl rumbling in his chest. My hands were sweating as I loaded the shotgun, careful to keep the sound as quiet as possible. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The campground was dark except for a few dying embers from other sites' fires. The moon was just a sliver, not providing much light. I couldn't see anything moving in the woods beyond our sight, but I had this overwhelming feeling of being watched. Then came the fifth call. This one was different. It started the same way, but midway through it changed, became choppy, almost like laughter. Then it abruptly cut off. The sound had been close enough that I felt it more than heard it, like bass that you feel in your chest at a concert. I sat there, shotgun across my lap, staring out into the darkness, waiting for the next call. Minutes ticked by. 5, 10, 15. Nothing came. Just that oppressive silence that had fallen over everything. Around 4:30, the normal forest sounds gradually returned. First a few crickets, then frogs by the river, then all the usual nighttime noises of the woods. It was like whatever had been out there had moved on, and nature was cautiously coming back to life. I didn't sleep. I sat there, gun ready, watching the tree line until the first hints of dawn appeared around 5:15. Even then, I didn't relax until full daylight came around 6:30. My family woke up completely unaware of what had happened. My wife noticed the shotgun and asked why. I had it out. I just said I'd heard some rustling around the campsite and wanted to be safe. I didn't want to scare the kids. While they were making breakfast, I walked over to the neighboring campsite where those college kids had been partying. I wanted to ask if they'd heard anything strange, but their site was empty, completely packed up and gone. No tents, no coolers, nothing. Just some trash and the cold remains of their fire. I asked the camp host when they left, and he looked at me strangely. "Nobody was at that site last night," he said. "That group canceled their reservation yesterday afternoon." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. I know what I heard earlier in the night. People talking, music playing. I wasn't imagining things, but I didn't argue with him. I just nodded and walked back to our campsite, feeling cold despite the morning sun. We finished our camping trip, but I didn't sleep another minute the whole weekend. I kept the shotgun close and found excuses to keep us away from the river during the day. We left a day early, with me making up some excuse about work. It's been 25 years now, and I've never been back to Surrey County. I've spent countless hours researching, trying to figure out what I heard that night. I've listened to recordings of every animal native to Virginia: bears, coyotes, foxes, owls, you name it. Nothing matches. I've even ventured into cryptid territory, reading about Bigfoot vocalizations and other folklore, but nothing quite fits what I experienced. The thing that still bothers me most isn't just the sound itself, but how it affected everything around it, how it silenced the entire forest, how my dog, who would bark at his own shadow, just growled quietly instead of raising hell, how those neighbors who'd been so loud just weren't there. I still have trouble sleeping, but now it's for different reasons. Sometimes, when I'm lying awake at 3 in the morning in my suburban home hundreds of miles from Surrey County, I catch myself listening, terrified I'll hear that sound again, that mournful wail that starts low and rises to a pitch that seems to reach inside you and twist something deep in your core. Whatever was out there that night, I hope I never encounter it again. But a part of me is always listening for it, always waiting, always wondering what might have happened if it had come just a little closer to our tent. Story 4. I've been debating whether to post this for years now. My wife still laughs about it whenever it comes up, but I swear on everything I hold dear that what I saw that day in Montana wasn't normal. I'm not the type to make up stories or believe in paranormal stuff. I'm a mechanical engineer, for God's sake. I deal in facts, measurements, and logical explanations. But this I can't explain. It happened back in December of 2015. My wife and I had gone to visit her sister in Kalispell, Montana for Christmas. We decided to stay a couple extra days after the holiday to enjoy the winter scenery, maybe do some skiing. On December 27th, we woke up to perfect weather. Clear blue skies, fresh snow on the ground, and temperatures just cold enough to keep the snow pristine, but not so frigid that you couldn't enjoy being outside. We decided on a whim to rent a snowmobile for the day. Neither of us had much experience with them, but it seemed like a fun way to explore. We found this little mom-and-pop rental place just outside of town. The old guy running it was super friendly, gave us a quick lesson on operating the machine, pointed us towards some beginner-friendly national forest trails, and sent us on our way. The snowmobile was a 2-seater, with me driving and my wife holding onto me from behind. I remember feeling pretty badass at first, like we were in some winter sports commercial or something. The reality was less glamorous. I was driving, cautiously, probably annoying any real snowmobilers who might have been behind us. The first hour was incredible. The trails wound through these dense pine forests, with snow weighing down the branches. Every now and then, we'd pass another snowmobile or see cross-country skiers on parallel trails. The engine noise would echo off the trees, but when we stopped to take pictures, the silence was absolute. That kind of winter silence that feels almost physical, like you could reach out and touch it. Around midday, we came to this section where the forest opened up into a wide clearing. There were high-tension power lines running through it, those massive metal structures standing like giants against the sky. The snow was deeper here, unprotected from the wind that had blown it into gentle waves across the open space. The trail we were following crossed under the power lines and continued into more forest on the other side. As we moved into the clearing, I noticed the terrain getting rougher. There were these hidden dips and bumps under the snow that made the snowmobile bounce uncomfortably. My wife tightened her grip around my waist, and I could tell she wasn't enjoying this part as much. "Let's turn around," she shouted over the engine noise. "This is getting too rough." I nodded and slowed down, looking for a good spot to make the turn. Up ahead, I could see what looked like a service road that crossed the clearing perpendicular to our trail. It seemed wider and flatter, perfect for turning the snowmobile around without risking tipping it over. When we reached the service road, I brought the snowmobile to a stop and killed the engine. The sudden silence was startling. My ears were ringing slightly from the engine noise, and I could hear my wife's breathing behind me as she relaxed her grip. "This is beautiful," she said, looking around at the expanse of white under the blue sky. I agreed and took a moment to catch my breath, pulling off my gloves to adjust my helmet. That's when I decided to take one more look at the view behind us before we headed back, and that's when I saw it. About 200 meters back the way we had come, moving across the clearing, was a figure. My first thought was that it was a cross-country skier. That would have made sense. We'd seen several on the trails earlier, but as I focused on it, something felt immediately, profoundly wrong. This thing was huge, not just tall, but massive. I'm 6'1", and this figure had to be at least 9 or 10 feet tall. It had the unmistakable shape of a man, broad shoulders that tapered down to a narrower waist, long arms and legs. But the proportions were all wrong. It was moving fast, not like someone skiing, but like someone walking with purpose. Long, deliberate strides that covered ground quickly. There were no ski poles, no visible equipment. Just this enormous figure moving through the snow with an unnatural smoothness. The color is what really got to me. The entire figure was covered in what I can only describe as a dark, pinkish-brown color, like raw meat that's been left out too long, except for its face. Even from that distance, I could tell its face was black, not brown or dark-skinned, but a deep, lightless black that stood out against the snow and the rest of its body. The way it moved was what still haunts me. It was both fluid and heavy at the same time, like it was gliding through the snow without effort, but each step had this weight to it, this presence, like it was impossibly heavy and impossibly light all at once. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I just stared, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The whole encounter lasted maybe 5 seconds before the figure passed behind a stand of trees at the edge of the clearing. "Nathan, you okay?" My wife's voice snapped me back to reality. I realized I was still holding my gloves, my hands starting to get cold. "Yeah, I'm fine," I said automatically, my brain still processing what I'd just witnessed. "Are we heading back?" she asked. "In a minute," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just want to check something out." I started the snowmobile again and drove slowly toward where I had seen the figure cross. My wife didn't question it. She probably thought I was just getting a feel for the machine before making the turn. When we reached the spot, I stopped again and got off, telling my wife I wanted to stretch my legs. What I was really doing was scanning the snow for tracks. There should have been ski tracks, footprints, something, but there was nothing. Just pristine snow, untouched except for our own snowmobile track. I walked a few meters in each direction, looking for any sign that something had passed through. Nothing. I looked toward where the figure had disappeared into the trees. Beyond that point was dense forest, thick with underbrush that would have been impossible for even a normal-sized person to pass through without leaving obvious signs. There were no broken branches, no disturbed snow, nothing. I felt cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. I hurried back to the snowmobile, where my wife was waiting patiently. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I lied, putting my helmet back on. "Just needed to stretch." We turned around and headed back toward the rental place. The whole way back, I kept scanning the forest edges, half expecting to see that figure again. I didn't. It wasn't until we were back at her sister's house, sitting around the dinner table, that I finally brought it up. "Did you see anyone else on the trail today?" I asked my wife casually, like maybe a cross-country skier when we were in that clearing. She looked at me like I was crazy. No, we were the only ones out there. Why? I hesitated. Then, trying to sound as rational as possible, I described what I'd seen. As I spoke, I could see her expression change from curiosity to amusement. "So let me get this straight," she said, when I finished. "You think you saw Bigfoot?" "I didn't say that," I protested, though that's exactly what had been going through my mind. "I'm just saying I saw something weird." She laughed. "Babe, it was probably just another skier, and the distance made them look bigger. Or maybe it was a moose. They're huge." "It wasn't a moose," I said firmly. "It was walking on two legs, like a man, but not." "Uh-huh," she said, still grinning. "Whatever you say, Sasquatch hunter." And that was it. She's been teasing me about my Bigfoot sighting ever since. Whenever we go hiking or camping, she'll suddenly freeze and whisper dramatically, "Did you hear that? I think it's your pink Bigfoot." But here's the thing. I know what I saw. And it wasn't a skier, it wasn't a moose, and I don't think it was a Bigfoot either, at least not in the traditional sense. It was something else, something wrong. I've spent countless hours researching, trying to find anything similar. The closest I've come are obscure Native American legends from the Pacific Northwest about strange ones that walk the forests. But even those descriptions don't quite match what I saw. The height, the color, the movement, none of it makes sense. A person couldn't have been that tall. An animal wouldn't have walked that way. And nothing explains the lack of tracks in fresh snow. It's been over 7 years now, and I still think about it regularly. I've never gone back to that specific trail, though we've visited Kalispell a few times since. Part of me wants to return to see if I can find any evidence or explanation. But a bigger part is afraid of what I might find, or what might find me. I know how this sounds. If someone told me this story, I'd probably react exactly like my wife did. But I know what I saw. It was real. It was there. And it was nothing that should exist in our world. I don't expect anyone to believe me, but I needed to put this out there. Maybe someone else has seen something similar. Maybe I'm not crazy, or maybe I am. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, a momentary hallucination, or my brain misinterpreting some ordinary wilderness encounter. That would be the rational explanation, the one I should accept. But deep down, I know better. For 5 seconds on a winter day in Montana, I saw something impossible, and I've never been quite the same since. Story 5. I don't talk about this much. I've tried to bury it under layers of maybe we imagined it, or we were just kids with wild imaginations. But that's not true. What my brother, my neighbor, and I saw that summer evening in 1978 was real. I'm 43 years old now, and I can still see it when I close my eyes. I was 9 years old that summer in Barnwell, South Carolina. We lived in this old farmhouse-style place with a big yard that backed right up to the woods. About 200 yards into those woods was an abandoned railroad track that hadn't seen a train in decades. My parents were always warning us to stay away from there, said the old trestles weren't safe, that we could fall through rotted wood or cut ourselves on rusted metal. Looking back now, I wonder if they knew something we didn't. My younger brother Mark was 7, and our neighbor Sally was 11. Sally lived about a quarter-mile up the road, and she'd bike over most days during summer break. Being the oldest, she kind of appointed herself our leader, though I always tried to act like I was in charge since it was my yard. The thing about being a kid in a small town back then, you made your own fun. No video games, no internet. We'd spend hours building forts, playing tag, making up elaborate games where sticks became swords and pine cones became grenades. And despite my parents' warnings, we'd sometimes sneak to the edge of the property, right where our mowed lawn gave way to the wild tangle of the woods. We never went in too deep, just far enough to feel like we were breaking the rules a little. That day, July 12th, I'll never forget the date, had been hot and sticky like most summer days in South Carolina. The evening was cooling down, and we were playing this game Sally made up called Border Patrol, where we had to guard our territory from invisible invaders. Mark and I had made these badges out of aluminum foil earlier that day. I remember that stupid detail so clearly, how the foil kept tearing and how proud I was when I finally got mine to hold together. It was getting close to dinner time, probably around 7 or so. The sun wasn't quite setting yet, but it was lower in the sky, casting these long shadows across our yard. We were near the edge of our property, maybe 30 feet from where the woods started. My mum had called out the back door that dinner would be ready in 20 minutes, but we were trying to squeeze in one last patrol. That's when we heard it. It's hard to describe that sound accurately. It was this high-pitched metallic screech that seemed to vibrate in my chest. Not like an animal, not like machinery exactly either. It was almost like someone dragging something heavy across those old railroad tracks, but amplified and distorted. It echoed through the trees and seemed to come from everywhere at once. We all froze. Sally whispered, "What was that?" And I tried to act brave, but my heart was racing. Mark grabbed my arm and said, "Jake, I want to go back." But something about that sound, it pulled at my curiosity in a way I couldn't resist. "Let's just see what it is," I said. "Maybe it's just some kids messing around." Sally, always trying to prove she wasn't scared of anything, nodded. "Yeah, let's check it out. We'll just peek." We moved toward the tree line, and I remember how the temperature seemed to drop as we got closer to the woods. The cicadas had gone quiet too, which should have been a warning sign. In the south, when the insects go silent, something's wrong. We didn't go deep into the woods, just far enough that we could see the old tracks through the trees. They were about 50 yards in from where we stood, rusty and partially overgrown. The sound had stopped, and everything was eerily still. "See? Nothing," I said, trying to sound disappointed rather than relieved. "Let's go back before Mom." That's when the air changed. It's hard to explain, but it felt suddenly heavy, like right before a thunderstorm. The hairs on my arms stood up. I remember looking at Sally and seeing her eyes widen as she stared past me toward the tracks. I turned slowly, and that's when I saw it. From the other side of the tracks, from deeper in the woods, something was emerging. At first, all I could make out was movement, this massive dark shape shifting between the trees. Then it stepped into a patch of fading sunlight that cut through the canopy and onto the tracks. It was huge. I'm not exaggerating when I say it stood at least 9 feet tall, maybe taller. Its body was covered in this thick, dark brown hair that hung in long, matted tufts. The hair was longest around its shoulders and arms. God, those arms were wrong. They hung down almost to its knees, too long for its body, with massive hands that seemed almost human, but not quite right. But it was the face that has haunted me for 34 years. It wasn't an animal face, not fully. It looked disturbingly human-like. Not exactly a man's face, but not entirely ape-like either. The facial hair was sparser, and underneath you could see skin that looked almost like tanned leather. And its eyes, they weren't vacant like an animal's. They looked intelligent, aware. When they locked onto us, I knew. It recognized us as human children. It wasn't just seeing us, it was perceiving us. For what felt like forever, but was probably only seconds, nobody moved. Not us, not it. We just stared at each other across that distance. Then it shifted its weight, and won. Massive foot crushed a fallen branch with a crack that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. That broke the spell. Mark screamed first, this high-pitched wail that didn't even sound human. Then Sally and I started screaming too. We turned and ran, pure panic taking over. I remember my feet catching on roots and underbrush as we burst out of the tree line and into our yard. I was certain it was right behind us. I could feel its presence like a physical weight on my back. My legs were moving so fast they didn't feel connected to my body anymore. I heard my mother's voice. She must have heard our screams and rushed outside. The back door of our house was flung open, light spilling out into the darkening yard. We ran toward it like it was a lighthouse in a storm. "Inside! Now!" my mom was shouting, her face a mask of confusion and fear. We barreled past her, all three of us tumbling into the kitchen, gasping and crying. "Lock the door! Lock it!" Sally was screaming, her face streaked with tears, leaves tangled in her hair from branches we'd crashed through. My mom slammed the door shut and turned the deadbolt. "What happened? Are you hurt? What's out there?" She was checking us for injuries, but we were just shaking, trying to speak between sobs. "A monster," Mark kept saying. "A monster in the woods." My dad came running from the living room, probably thinking we were being chased by a neighbor's dog or had seen a snake. "What's going on?" We tried to explain, all talking over each other. "It was huge. By the tracks, it looked at us." My dad grabbed a flashlight and his shotgun from the closet. "Stay here," he told my mom, his face grim. He went outside to check. Those minutes he was gone were the longest of my life. I was convinced he wouldn't come back, that whatever we'd seen would take him. When the back door finally opened again, I nearly threw up from relief. He came in shaking his head. "Nothing out there that I could see." He looked at us sternly. "Were you kids in the woods, by the tracks?" We couldn't lie, not in that moment. We nodded, shame mixing with our fear. "How many times have I told you to stay away from there?" His voice was angry, but I could hear the worry underneath. "There are drop-offs, old trestles. You could have been seriously hurt." "But Dad," I insisted, "we saw something. It was huge and hairy and probably a bear." He cut me off. "There have been reports of one moving through the area. That's another reason to stay out of those woods." "But it wasn't a bear. We all knew it wasn't a bear." My mom called Sally's parents, who came to pick her up. She wouldn't walk home alone, not even with my dad offering to accompany her. She just kept shaking her head, her eyes wide and vacant. She didn't come back to our house for over a month. That night, Mark dragged his mattress into my room. Neither of us slept much. Every crack of the house settling, every whisper of wind against the windows had us sitting bolt upright, certain it had come for us. "Jake," Mark whispered around midnight, "did you see its face?" "Yeah," I answered, my throat tight. "It looked like a person," he said. "Not all the way, but its eyes knew us." I couldn't argue with him. That was exactly what had disturbed me most. The next morning, my dad went back to check the area in daylight. He came back looking troubled, but wouldn't say what, if anything, he'd found. He reinforced his rule about staying away from the woods and the tracks, and this time, we listened. For the rest of that summer, we stayed in the yard. When school started again, we gradually began to talk about other things, to focus on normal kid stuff. But I'd catch Mark staring at the woods sometimes, and I knew he was thinking about it too. Sally's family moved away that fall. Before she left, she came over one last time. We sat on the front porch as far from the woods as we could get. "Do you think about it?" she asked. "All the time," I admitted. "Me too," she said. "My parents think I made it up, or that it was just a bear." "Same with mine." She looked at me, her face serious in a way an 11-year-old shouldn't be. "We know what we saw, Jake." And we did. Years passed. I grew up, went to college, moved away from Barnwell. My parents sold the house when I was in my 20s. Mark and I didn't talk about that day. It was like we'd made an unspoken agreement to pretend it never happened. Then, 5 years ago, at our father's funeral, Mark and I found ourselves alone on the porch of his house, sharing a beer. "Do you ever think about that thing we saw?" he asked suddenly, his voice quiet. "By the tracks?" The question sent a chill through me, even after all those years. "Yeah," I admitted, "more than I want to." "I looked it up," he said. "Online. There are other reports. Similar things seen in those woods, dating back decades." We talked then, for the first time as adults, comparing our memories. They aligned perfectly, the height, the hair, the unsettlingly human face. It wasn't a childhood fantasy that had grown in the telling. If anything, we'd both downplayed details in our minds, trying to make it less terrifying. You know what still gets me? Mark said. It wasn't aggressive, it just watched us. Like it was as surprised to see us as we were to see it. I'd thought the same thing many times. Whatever we saw that day, it didn't chase us. It didn't threaten us. It just stood there, watching with those two intelligent eyes. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, moving silently through the woods that probably look very different now. I wonder if other children have glimpsed it between the trees and run home to parents who didn't believe them. I never go back to Barnwell if I can help it. And to this day, the sound of metal scraping against metal makes my blood run cold. Some things once seen can't be unseen. They change the way you understand the world, what you believe can exist in it. That creature, whatever it was, showed me that the boundaries between what we know and what we don't are thinner than we think. And sometimes what waits on the other side is watching us too. Story 6. I've only told this story to a handful of people over the years. Most don't believe me, and honestly, I'm not sure I'd believe it either if I hadn't lived through it myself. But what my sister Emma and I saw that day in 1991 is as clear in my mind now as it was then. We were 19 and 17 at the time, just a couple of kids from Kyoto, Oklahoma, with nothing better to do on a Saturday afternoon than ride my old Kawasaki through the back roads. Kyoto's a small place, the kind of town where everyone knows everyone, and there's not much excitement beyond high school football games and the occasional town festival. The surrounding woods and hills were our playground growing up. That particular day in early October was perfect riding weather. Not too hot, not too cold. The leaves were just starting to change, and the air had that crisp fall feeling that makes you want to be outside. Emma had been bugging me all week to take her for a ride, so I finally gave in. She climbed on the back of my bike around 2 in the afternoon, and we headed out toward the old logging roads that cut through the hills east of town. We'd been riding for maybe an hour, just enjoying the freedom of it. The woods around Kyoto are dense, mostly oak and pine with thick undergrowth in some areas. There are stretches where you can ride for miles without seeing another person or house. We knew these roads well though, had been exploring them since we were kids on bicycles. We came around a bend in the road and started up a gentle slope. The trees opened up a bit on the right side, where an old power line cut through, creating a kind of corridor in the forest. That's when I first noticed them. About 200 yards ahead, I spotted what I thought were 2 people standing at the edge of the clearing where the power line ran. From that distance, they just looked like a couple of guys maybe hunting or hiking. I remember thinking it might be the Wilson brothers who lived a few miles over, so I slowed down a bit and veered slightly in their direction. Emma tapped my shoulder and pointed. She'd seen them too. I nodded and kept riding toward them, cutting the speed to about 20 miles per hour as we got closer. But something started feeling off. The way they were standing was strange, completely still, just watching us approach. And they were big. Much bigger than I initially thought. When we got within about 100 yards, I started getting this crawling sensation up my spine. These weren't people. They were the right general shape, standing upright on 2 legs, but everything else was wrong. They were massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders that seemed to hunch forward slightly. And they were covered in hair, thick, dark hair that moved slightly in the breeze. I let the bike coast a bit slower, and Emma's grip around my waist tightened. I could feel her tense up behind me. We were maybe 75 yards away now, and I could see their faces. That's what really shook me. They had faces that were almost human, but not quite. Their features were set differently, heavy brow ridges, wide noses, and their eyes. Their eyes were dark and deeply set, but unmistakably intelligent. For a moment, just a few seconds really, we all just stared at each other. They were standing there at the edge of the tree line, completely exposed in the clearing. One was slightly larger than the other, with darker hair that was almost black, while the smaller one, though still enormous, had more of a reddish-brown coat, Their arms hung longer than a human's would, with massive hands that hung at about mid-thigh. Then the bigger one shifted its weight, and I swear to God, it looked right at me, made direct eye contact. There was something in that look, recognition, awareness, intelligence that made my blood run cold. These weren't animals. They understood exactly what was happening. Without any warning, they both turned and bolted for the woods. It wasn't the awkward run you'd expect from something that big. It was smooth, powerful, and terrifyingly fast. They covered the 30 yards to the dense tree line in seconds, moving with a speed that nothing that size should be capable of. I don't know what possessed me, curiosity or stupidity, but I coasted the bike up to where they had been standing and cut the engine. Emma was whispering frantically, asking what I was doing, but I needed to see something. Proof, maybe. The silence when I shut off that engine was absolute. For about 3 seconds there was nothing, just the October wind through the trees and our own breathing. Then we heard it, the sound of branches breaking deep in the forest, not the light snap of a squirrel or raccoon moving through the underbrush, but heavy, deliberate breaks that echoed through the trees. Something massive was moving in there, pushing through the forest with tremendous force. I was just about to restart the bike when the first rock came flying out of the tree line. It wasn't thrown randomly. It was aimed directly at us, whizzing past my head and hitting the ground about 10 feet behind us. Then another one, bigger this time, landing just short of the front tire. "James, go!" Emma was screaming now, her fingers digging into my sides. I was fumbling with the key when a branch, not a stick, but an actual branch the size of my arm, came hurling out of the forest, smashing into the ground beside us. Then, from somewhere in the darkness of those trees came a sound I'll never forget. A harsh, guttural scream that was nothing like any animal I'd ever heard. It wasn't a howl or a roar. It had syllables to it, patterns, like it was trying to form words, but couldn't quite manage it. And then the second one answered from further in, a sound so deep and powerful, I swear I felt it more than heard it. It was like standing next to a subwoofer, a vibration that went right through your chest. The forest seemed to go quiet after that roar, like everything in those woods was holding its breath. I finally got the engine started, and we tore out of there so fast I nearly laid the bike down on the first curve. Emma was pressed against my back, her face buried between my shoulder blades. I could feel her trembling, or maybe that was me. I didn't slow down until we hit the main road, and even then, I kept checking the mirrors like I expected to see those things running after us. We didn't talk about it on the ride home. I think we were both in shock. When we finally pulled into our driveway, Emma got off the bike and just stood there for a minute, staring at nothing. Her face was pale and her hands were shaking. "Those weren't bears," she finally said. It wasn't a question. "No," I answered. "They weren't bears." We went inside, and Mom asked us why we were back so early. I made up some excuse about the bike not running right. We didn't tell our parents. What would we have said? That we saw Bigfoot? 2 of them? They'd have thought we were making it up, or that we'd been drinking or something. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing those eyes, that direct gaze that held mine for just a moment before they ran. There was intelligence there, not just animal awareness, but something that recognized us as fellow thinking beings. And there was something else that still haunts me. Those creatures were angry. We had invaded their space, and they were letting us know it wasn't welcome. The next morning, Emma and I talked about going back with Dad's camera. But when it came time to actually get on the bike, neither of us could do it. The fear was too raw, too real. We knew what was out there now. Over the next few weeks, I found myself researching everything I could about Bigfoot sightings in Oklahoma. Turns out there had been stories for years, loggers, hunters, and hikers reporting glimpses of large, hair-covered creatures in the forests around the Ozark foothills. Most were dismissed as bear sightings or hoaxes, but I knew better now. What strikes me most, looking back, is how clearly I saw them. It wasn't some blurry shape in the distance or something glimpsed through fog or darkness. It was broad daylight, clear conditions, and we got within 70 yards before they ran. I saw their faces, their expressions, the way their muscles moved under that thick hair as they turned to run. There's no way we misidentified what we saw. The rocks and branches they threw, that was the part that really shook me. That showed problem-solving, tool use, and coordinated aggression. They were communicating with each other and responding to our presence with deliberate actions. That scream and answering roar were a language of sorts. They were talking to each other about us. I never went back to that specific area again. I sold the motorcycle a few months later, telling myself it was because I needed the money for college. But the truth is, I couldn't ride those back roads anymore without constantly scanning the tree line, jumping at every shadow. Emma and I don't talk about it much these days. But sometimes when we're together at family gatherings and the conversation lulls, I'll catch her eye and know she's thinking about it too. About what we saw that day in the woods near Kyoto. About the fact that there are things out there in the wilderness of Oklahoma that most people don't believe in and will never see. I know what we saw. I know they saw us too. And sometimes, especially on windy autumn days, I still think about those dark, intelligent eyes looking directly into mine, and I wonder if they remember us as clearly as we remember them. Story 7. Audrey, I've been avoiding the woods ever since I was 16. It's been almost 7 years now, and I still get sweaty palms just thinking about that day. I've never been the type to believe in paranormal stuff or cryptids. I was always the skeptical kid who needed proof for everything. But what happened that afternoon in April changed everything for me. My name's Ethan. I grew up in Millerton, not the town itself, but in the rural outskirts where houses are far apart and the forest seems endless. My best friend Brandon lived about 3 miles away with his grandmother after his parents moved to Arizona for work. His grandma's place was this old farmhouse with about 7 acres of land that backed right up to a dense forest. We spent most weekends there because his grandma was cool and basically let us do whatever we wanted. That weekend started like any other. I biked over to Brandon's on Saturday morning. We played video games, ate junk food, and by mid-afternoon, we were bored out of our minds. Brandon suggested we go check out the pond at the edge of his grandma's property. It was something we did pretty often. Just wandering around looking for frogs or turtles, or building little dams in the creek. When we got to the pond, something was off. There were maybe 6 or 7 fish floating dead on the surface of the water. At first, I thought nothing of it. Fish die all the time, right? But Brandon pointed out something weird. Each fish was broken in half, not torn or chewed up like if a raccoon or bird had gotten to them. They were literally snapped in two, with the pieces floating near each other. Some still had the spine connecting the halves, bent at an unnatural angle. What the hell could do that? Brandon asked, poking one with a stick. I remember the chill that ran down my spine. It didn't make sense. If an animal had killed them for food, they would have been eaten or at least shown bite marks. These looked like someone had just picked them up and snapped them in half for fun. Maybe some jerk kids, I suggested, but even as I said it, I knew it didn't make sense. Nobody ever came out this far except us. We spent about 20 minutes examining the fish and theorizing, but eventually it got dark and we headed back to his grandma's house. That night I couldn't stop thinking about those fish. It bothered me in a way I couldn't explain. The next day, Sunday, we decided to go back and investigate more. Brandon thought maybe we'd find other dead animals or some clue about what happened. It was around 2 in the afternoon when we headed out, the sun high in the sky, making it hot despite being early spring. We reached the pond first. The dead fish were still there, looking even more grotesque after a day in the sun, but now there were more, at least 5 additional fish, all broken the same way, fresh ones. This happened last night, Brandon whispered, his face pale. Something about seeing those new fish made my skin crawl. Whatever did this had returned while we were sleeping just a few hundred yards away. "Let's check further in," Brandon said, pointing to the woods beyond the pond. "Maybe we'll find something." I didn't want to go, but I also didn't want to look like a coward. So I followed him as we pushed past the first line of trees and into the forest proper. The temperature seemed to drop as soon as we entered the woods. The canopy blocked most of the sunlight, creating this eerie green glow as light filtered through the leaves. The ground was soft with years of fallen pine needles and leaves, muffling our footsteps. It smelled like wet earth and decay. We walked about 100 yards in, following no particular path, just pushing through underbrush and ducking under branches. I was starting to think this was a stupid idea when Brandon suddenly stopped. "I gotta take a leak," he announced. "Wait here." Before I could protest, he veered off to the right, disappearing behind some thick bushes about 20 feet away. I stood there awkwardly, listening to the sounds of the forest, birds chirping, leaves rustling in the light breeze, the distant sound of running water from the creek that fed the pond. That's when I heard it, a subtle shifting sound to my right, like something heavy moving its weight from one foot to another. At first I thought it was Brandon, but the sound came from the opposite direction. I turned my head slowly, almost reluctantly, as if some part of me already knew I didn't want to see what was making that noise. About 50 yards away, partially hidden behind a massive oak tree, was something that instantly made my blood run cold. I could only see part of it, a section of its head and shoulder as it peered around the tree, but that was enough to know this wasn't human, not even close. The portion of the head I could see was covered in dark, matted fur, not hair, fur, thick and wild, with what looked like twigs or leaves tangled in it. The eye that was visible was set deep in the face, but I couldn't make out its color from that distance. What I could see clearly was its shoulder and part of its arm, also covered in the same dark fur. The proportions were all wrong for a human. The shoulder was massive like a linebacker on steroids, and the arm that extended from it was thick as a tree trunk. I'm not great at estimating heights, especially when I could only see part of the thing, but comparing it to the tree it was standing behind, this thing had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. It wasn't crouching or hunched over like you'd expect from something trying to hide. It was just standing there, watching me. As I stared, frozen in place, it shifted slightly, moving more of its head into view. That movement snapped me out of my paralysis. I didn't call out to Brandon. I didn't even think about him. Pure survival instinct took over, and I turned and ran faster than I've ever run in my life. The forest floor was uneven, and I stumbled several times, my feet catching on exposed roots and fallen branches. Each time I nearly fell, the image of that thing catching up to me pushed me to recover and keep moving. My lungs burned and branches whipped at my face, but I didn't slow down. I burst out of the tree line near the pond, but I didn't stop. I sprinted across Brandon's grandma's property toward the house, not daring to look back. My mind was racing with terrified thoughts. What if it's following me? What about Brandon? Should I go back for him? But fear won out. I reached the back porch of the house and practically fell through the door, slamming it shut behind me and locking it with trembling hands. Brandon's grandma was in the kitchen and looked up startled. "Ethan, what's wrong? Where's Brandon?" I couldn't speak at first, just gasping for breath, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might explode. Finally, I managed to stammer out, "Something. In the woods. Brandon's still out there." She must have seen the genuine terror in my face because she immediately grabbed her phone, about to call someone, the police, I guess, when the back door opened and Brandon walked in looking confused. "Dude, what the hell?" he said. "You just took off. I came back and you were gone." Relief flooded through me, but it was quickly replaced by the lingering terror of what I'd seen. "There was something out there," I said, my voice cracking. "Something big." Brandon looked skeptical. "Like a bear?" I shook my head vehemently. No, not a bear. It was standing upright. It had fur, dark fur, and it was huge, like 8 feet tall at least. Brandon's grandma had put down the phone and was watching me closely. Ethan, there aren't any animals like that around here. But I knew what I saw. It was watching me. It was hiding behind a tree, but not really hiding, just observing. Brandon looked at his grandma, then back at me. Maybe it was just a shadow, or your eyes playing tricks. It wasn't a trick, I snapped, frustration mixing with the fear. I saw it move. They both just stared at me. I could tell they didn't believe me. And why would they? I was describing something impossible, something that shouldn't exist. The rest of that day was awkward. Brandon tried to act normal, but I could tell he thought I'd either imagined the whole thing or was making it up for attention. His grandma kept giving me these concerned looks, like she was worried about my mental health. I called my mom to pick me up early, claiming I felt sick. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that thing peering around the tree. I kept replaying the moment in my head, analyzing every detail, wondering if maybe they were right. Maybe my eyes had played tricks on me. But the more I thought about it, the more certain I became. The way it moved was deliberate. The proportions of its body were not human. The fur was real. Whatever I saw that day was real. I never went back into those woods. Brandon and I drifted apart after that. He tried to get me to go exploring with him a few more times, but I always refused. Eventually, he stopped asking. When we graduated high school, we went to different colleges, and now we only interact through occasional social media comments. I've researched what I might have seen. Bigfoot is the obvious answer. But that feels too simple too. Convenient. Whatever was in those woods that day felt older, more knowing. The way it watched me wasn't like an animal observing potential prey. It was studying me, like it understood exactly what I was and was curious about my presence in its territory. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, still watching the edge of the forest, still breaking fish in half at the pond. I wonder if Brandon ever saw it after I left. He never mentioned anything if he did. I drive past his grandma's property sometimes when I visit my parents. I always slow down when I pass the part where the forest edges up to the road. I never stop though. Some primal part of me knows better than to tempt whatever lives in those woods. Some things are better left alone, observed from a distance, and then never approached again. I still don't know what I saw that day, but I know it saw me too. And sometimes that's what keeps me up at night. The knowledge that something out there, something that shouldn't exist, knows my face. Story 8. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened that night. It's been over 30 years, and I've never been able to explain it. Never wanted to go back either. It was early October 1988. Me, Steve, and Mike had planned this hunting trip for weeks. We were all in our mid-20s then, grew up together in northeastern PA, and had been hunting these woods since we were teenagers. We knew the area like the backs of our hands, or at least we thought we did. We set up camp in the state gamelands near Route 118, where it meets Ridge Road, maybe 5 miles from Ricketts Glen. It's beautiful country, dense forest, rocky ridges, and small creeks cutting through valleys. Perfect for deer hunting, which was our plan for the next morning. The day had been normal enough. We'd arrived around 3 in the afternoon, hiked about a mile into the woods, and set up our tent on a small ridge overlooking a creek. After getting everything squared away, we collected firewood, cooked some burgers on the portable grill, and cracked open a few beers. Nothing crazy, just enough to take the edge off. We weren't drunk or anything close to it. The temperature dropped quick after the sun went down. It was probably in the low 40s by 8 o'clock, and we had a decent fire going. We were just bullshitting around the campfire, talking about work, women problems, the usual stuff. Steve was in the middle of some story about his boss when we heard it. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from the direction of the creek below our ridge. At first I figured it was a deer, but deer don't walk like that. They're gentle, cautious. These steps were purposeful, heavy, like something big was walking on 2 feet. "You guys hear that?" Mike whispered, interrupting Steve. We all went quiet. The footsteps continued, steady and slow. Whatever it was moving along the creek, maybe 30 or 40 yards below us. "Probably just a bear," Steve said, but he didn't sound convinced. We sat there listening as the footsteps moved eastward, circling around the base of our ridge. Bears in Pennsylvania aren't that uncommon, but they don't typically walk around on 2 legs for extended periods, and they definitely don't make the sound we heard next. It started as a low moan that built into this high-pitched scream. I've heard bobcats, foxes, all kinds of animals in these woods. This wasn't like any of them. It was almost human but distorted, like someone was being tortured. It made the hair on my neck stand straight up. "What the fuck was that?" Mike whispered, his face pale in the firelight. Before anyone could answer, the footsteps changed direction. Whatever it was coming up the ridge, toward us. We all stood up. Steve grabbed the flashlight, and I moved toward my rifle that was leaning against a nearby tree. Mike just stood there, frozen, staring into the darkness. The footsteps got louder, closer. I could hear branches snapping, leaves crunching. It was moving fast now, and it was big. You could feel the impact of each step. "Hello?" Steve called out, his voice shaking. "Anyone out there?" No response. Just more footsteps, now maybe 20 yards away from our camp. Close enough that we should have been able to see it in the darkness. But somehow we couldn't make out a clear shape, just movement, a disturbance in the blackness beyond our firelight. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst. I grabbed my rifle and chambered around. "We're armed," I shouted, trying to sound confident, but my voice cracked. "Identify yourself." That's when it let out another scream, louder this time, close enough that it felt like it was right in our faces. It wasn't just loud, it was primal, aggressive, threatening, and then crack. A massive sound like a gunshot, but it wasn't a gun. A tree had come down, just snapped like it was nothing. We all jumped back toward the fire. Whatever survival instinct humans have, it kicked in hard. We knew, without saying a word, that we needed to stay in the light. That's when it ran past us, just outside the circle of firelight. I caught a glimpse of something massive, moving faster than anything that size should be able to move. It was like watching a shadow detach itself from the darkness. No human could move that fast, especially not through dense forest at night. "Did you see that?" Mike's voice was barely audible. "What the fuck was that?" We stood there for what felt like hours, backs to the fire, facing outward with our rifles ready. Nobody wanted to be the first to move. Eventually, Steve volunteered to check out the sound of the fallen tree, but only if we all went together. We grabbed our rifles and flashlights and moved as a unit, never more than a few feet apart. About 20 yards from camp, we found it. A tree, maybe 6 to 8 inches thick, snapped clean off. Not cut, not blown over with roots exposed. Snapped. The break was about 8.5 feet off the ground. We measured it the next morning to be sure. It takes tremendous force to snap a healthy tree like that. A bear couldn't do it. A human definitely couldn't do it. We hurried back to the campfire and built it up as big as we could. None of us said much. What was there to say? We'd all seen and heard the same impossible thing. Around midnight, I noticed it again, that feeling of being watched. I shined my flashlight out into the trees and caught a brief reflection. 2 yellowish points of light, like eyes, about 7 feet off the ground. They disappeared immediately. "It's still out there," I whispered. Throughout the night, we took turns keeping watch while the others tried to sleep. But I don't think any of us actually closed our eyes for more than a few minutes. Every hour or so, we'd hear movement just beyond the firelight. Heavy steps, branches breaking. Sometimes it would move closer. We could sense a large shape approaching the edge of our camp, but whenever we'd reach for our rifles or shine a light, it would retreat. By dawn, we were exhausted, strung out from fear and lack of sleep. As soon as there was enough light to see, We packed up and got the hell out of there. None of us wanted to stick around and see what had been stalking us in daylight. On the hike back to our truck, we found tracks along the creek. They looked almost like barefoot human prints, but bigger, much bigger, and the stride length was impossible, like 7 or 8 feet between steps. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but it wasn't. Against our better judgment, we went back to those woods twice more over the next couple months. I don't know why, maybe to convince ourselves we'd imagined it all. Maybe because we were young and stupid, or maybe because there's something in human nature that needs to confront the things that terrify us. The second trip in early November was quiet until about 2 in the morning when we heard the same footsteps circling our camp. This time we were prepared. Bigger fire, more ammo, even a camera. Fat lot of good that did us. The photos just showed darkness and maybe some movement, nothing clear. But the third trip, late November, that's when we saw it, or at least part of it. We'd set up camp in the same spot, figuring whatever it was. At least we knew its territory now. Around 10 p.m., Mike spotted something crouched at the edge of the firelight. We all turned our flashlights in that direction, and for just a second we caught it, a large, hunched shape covered in dark black hair or fur. And the eyes, yellow, reflective eyes that caught the beam of our flashlights before it bolted away faster than anything that size should move. It was there and gone in seconds, but that image is burned into my brain. Those eyes. Not animal eyes, not human eyes. Something else. We packed up that same night and left. None of us have been back to that part of the woods since. I've spent years trying to rationalize what we experienced. Could it have been a bear? Maybe. But bears don't walk exclusively on 2 legs for hours. They don't scream like that. They can't snap a tree 8 feet off the ground or move with that kind of speed. Was it some kind of hoax? A person trying to scare us? I don't see how. No human could make those sounds or move that way. And why would someone spend 3 separate nights just to frighten random campers? I've read about Bigfoot sightings in Pennsylvania. The locals around Ricketts Glen have stories going back generations about something in those woods. I used to laugh at that stuff. I don't laugh anymore. I'm 49 now. I still hunt, still camp, but never alone and never in those woods. Steve and Mike and I, we don't talk about it much anymore. What's the point? Nobody believes you when you tell them something like this. They smile and nod and think you're exaggerating or that we were drunk or high. We weren't. Something was out there that night. Something that shouldn't exist but does. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if it's still there, walking through those woods, watching and waiting for someone else to make the mistake of camping on its territory. I don't know what it was. I don't want to know. But I know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. And 30 years later, I still check the locks twice before going to bed. Story 9. I've been camping all my life. Started going with my dad when I was just a kid, and I've probably spent hundreds of nights in the woods by now. I know what animals sound like. I know what the forest sounds like at night, and I know when something isn't right. What happened to me at Lake Shasta still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. This was back in April of 2003, April 19th to be exact. I remember the date because it was the weekend after my 32nd birthday, and I'd decided to treat myself to a solo camping trip. I'd been to Jones Valley Campground before, but never alone. It's a beautiful spot, especially in spring when everything's green and the lake is full from the winter rain. I set up my tent about 50 yards from the shore in a nice little clearing surrounded by pines and oaks. Had a simple setup, just my 2-person tent, a folding chair and a small fire pit I dug myself. The day was perfect. Spent most of it hiking and fishing, caught a couple of decent-sized bass that I cleaned and cooked over the fire for dinner. As night fell, I noticed something odd. Usually in forests, especially near water, you get this symphony of sounds after dark. Crickets chirping, frogs calling from the lake edge, the occasional hoot of an owl. But that night, around 10 o'clock, As I sat by my dying campfire nursing a beer, I realized it was completely silent. Not the peaceful kind of quiet that makes you feel at peace with nature. This was different. It felt wrong, like everything around me was holding its breath. I remember checking my watch, exactly 10 p.m., and thinking maybe a storm was coming. Animals often go quiet before bad weather, but there wasn't a cloud in the sky. The stars were out, brilliant against the black, and there wasn't even a breeze, just this unnatural silence pressing in around me. That's when I heard it. The sharp, distinct crack of a large tree branch snapping, somewhere in the darkness beyond my campsite. It came from the densely wooded area about 50 yards behind my tent, away from the lake. I froze, beer halfway to my lips, listening. This wasn't the sound of a dead branch naturally falling from a tree. It was deliberate, the kind of snap that happens when something heavy steps on a branch and breaks it. I've heard deer and even bears moving through undergrowth, and this wasn't that. It was too intentional. I called out, thinking maybe another camper had wandered off trail. "Hello? Someone there?" My voice sounded thin and weak in the silence. Nothing, no response. I told myself it was probably just a deer, even though I knew better. The sound had been too loud, too singular. Deer move with multiple steps, creating a pattern of sounds. This had been one isolated crack. I stoked my fire a bit, added another log. The flames flared up, casting my shadow long across the ground, but not penetrating more than a few feet into the wall of darkness surrounding my little circle of light. For about 10 minutes, nothing happened. Just that continuing, suffocating silence. I started to relax a little, convincing myself I was being paranoid. Then another branch snapped. This one was closer, maybe 40 yards away now, still in the woods, still hidden from sight, but definitely nearer than before. And again, just that single, isolated sound. Not the random noise of forest creatures going about their business. It felt calculated, like whatever made the sound wanted me to hear it. My heart started beating faster. I stood up, turning to face the direction of the sound, straining my eyes to see into the darkness, but it was pitch black beyond the firelight. "Who's there?" I called again, trying to sound authoritative rather than scared. "This is private campsite." More silence, but now I felt watched. You know that feeling when the hairs on the back of your neck stand up? Like that, but worse. Like something was studying me, assessing me. I grabbed my flashlight, one of those heavy mag lights that can double as a weapon if needed, and shined it toward where I'd heard the sound. The beam cut through the darkness between the trees, but revealed nothing unusual. Just trunks, branches, shadows. I decided to get in my tent, started gathering my things, moving quickly, but trying not to look panicked. That's when I heard the footsteps. They came from the same direction as the snapping branches. Slow, deliberate footsteps, maybe 10 to 13 distinct steps, moving steadily in my direction. Heavy enough to make the ground compress audibly under their weight, but carefully placed. Not crashing through undergrowth like an animal would. These were controlled, purposeful, and they sounded bipedal, not the 4-beat rhythm of a deer or even a bear occasionally standing on hind legs. This was the unmistakable cadence of something walking on 2 legs. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The footsteps stopped too, as if whatever was making them knew I was listening and didn't want to give away its position anymore. At this point, I was scared enough that I decided to wake up my camping buddy, Mike. I'd totally forgotten to mention I wasn't actually alone that weekend. I'd planned a solo trip, but at the last minute, Mike and his girlfriend Jen had asked if they could join. They'd brought their small camper and parked it about 30 yards from my tent. They'd gone to bed early, around 9, saying something about hiking early the next morning. I hurried over to their camper, trying not to run, fighting the urge to look over my shoulder. I knocked on their door, probably harder than I needed to. It took a minute before Mike answered, looking groggy and annoyed. "What the hell, Vic? It's the middle of the night," he mumbled, squinting at me. "Something's out there," I whispered urgently. "In the woods. It's been making noises, getting closer. I need you to come listen." Mike looked skeptical but stepped out of the camper, pulling on a sweatshirt. "Probably just a raccoon or something," he said, but followed me back toward my campsite. We stood silently by my fire, which had died down to glowing embers. I was about to whisper to Mike what I'd heard when another branch snapped. This one was much closer, no more than 10 yards from where we stood. We both jumped. "Jesus!" Mike hissed. "What was that?" "That's what I've been hearing," I said. "That's the third one." And there were footsteps too. As if on cue, we heard them again. 3 or 4 heavy footfalls, deliberate and slow, moving parallel to the edge of my campsite. Then silence fell again, more oppressive than before. Mike and I stood absolutely still, straining to hear more. I could feel my heart pounding in my throat. The silence stretched on, broken only by the occasional pop from my dying fire. "Could be a bear," Mike finally whispered, but he didn't sound convinced. I shook my head. "Bears don't move like that. They don't snap branches to announce themselves, then walk on 2 legs, then stop and go silent. They make constant noise, snuffling, brushing against things. This is different." Mike looked genuinely uneasy now. "Maybe we should call the ranger station." "No cell service out here, remember?" I replied. "And the ranger station is closed this time of night anyway." We stood listening for another 5 minutes. Nothing. Whatever was out there had gone silent again. Finally, Mike shook his head. "Look, it's probably nothing. Some animal we're misinterpreting. I'm going back to bed. You should too." But I could tell he was rattled. He walked back to his camper much faster than he'd come to my campsite, and I heard him lock the door behind him. I should have followed his lead and gone to my tent, but something kept me rooted to the spot. A morbid curiosity, maybe, or the feeling that turning my back would somehow make me vulnerable. So I stayed, adding another log to the fire, trying to build it up. Again, the flames licked higher, pushing back the darkness a little more. I grabbed my flashlight again and began methodically scanning the tree line, moving the beam slowly from left to right, searching for any sign of movement, any reflection of eyes. Nothing, but that feeling of being watched intensified. It was like standing on a stage under a spotlight, knowing an audience is out there in the darkness, seeing you while remaining unseen themselves. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, I decided to try something. I announced loudly to the empty air, "I'm going to bed now," then made a show of dousing my fire and heading toward my tent. But instead of going inside, I circled around behind it and crouched in the shadows, watching the spot where I'd heard the last footsteps. For a long time, nothing happened. My legs started to cramp from staying in the same position. Just as I was about to give up, I saw movement. At the edge of the clearing, just barely visible in the ambient starlight, something shifted between 2 large pine trees. Something tall. I couldn't make out details. It was just a darker shape against the darkness, but it seemed to be leaning slightly forward, as if peering toward my tent, looking for me. I held my breath, afraid the sound of my breathing would give away my position. The shape remained motionless for maybe 30 seconds, then slowly withdrew back into the deeper shadows of the forest. I waited another 10 minutes before I dared move. My legs had gone completely numb. When I finally stood, pins and needles shooting through my feet, I made a decision. There was no way I was sleeping in that tent tonight. I went to Mike's camper and knocked again, more insistently this time. When he answered, looking even more annoyed than before, I didn't give him a chance to speak. "I saw something," I said. "By the tree line, something big, standing upright, watching my tent." Mike stared at me for a moment, then sighed. "Get in," he said, stepping aside. I spent the night on their tiny fold-out table that converted to a bed. Didn't sleep much, just lay there listening, wondering what was out there. In the morning, with sunlight streaming through the camper windows, It all seemed ridiculous. Mike and Jen were polite enough not to tease me too much, though I could tell they thought I'd let my imagination run wild. After breakfast, I went to check my campsite. Everything was as I'd left it. My tent was undisturbed. Nothing seemed out of place, but when I walked to the edge of the clearing, to the spot where I thought I'd seen the figure, I found something that made my blood run cold. There, pressed into the soft earth between the pine trees, was a single footprint. It was large, much bigger than my own size 11 boot, and it wasn't the print of any animal I recognized. It was roughly foot-shaped, but wider across the front, with what looked like 5 distinct toe impressions. The impression was deep, suggesting whatever made it was heavy. I called Mike over to see it. He stared at it for a long time, then shook his head. "Probably just a deformed bear print," he said, but I could tell he didn't believe that any more than I did. We packed up and left that morning, cutting our weekend short. Made excuses about bad weather coming, but the truth was, none of us wanted to spend another night there. I've been back to Lake Shasta since then, but never to Jones Valley Campground, never alone either. What I heard, what I saw, that night in April 2003 still haunts me. I've read about Bigfoot sightings in those mountains, about strange creatures people claim to have encountered in remote forests. I used to laugh at those stories. I don't laugh anymore. Because whatever was stalking me that night wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person playing a prank. It moved with too much purpose, too much intelligence. It wanted me to know it was there, just out of sight in the darkness, watching. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced I've heard the snap of a branch outside my window. And in those moments, I'm right back there, by that dying campfire, listening to something approach from the darkness, something that has no name. Story 10. I've been bird watching for almost 15 years now, and nothing has ever shaken me like what happened last April. I'm still hesitant to share this because I know how it sounds, but I need to get this off my chest. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar. This happened on April 12th, 2015. I remember the date exactly because I'd been planning this trip for weeks. Spring migration was in full swing, and I was hoping to spot some warblers passing through Mississippi. Big Creek Lake outside Hattiesburg has always been one of my favorite spots. Peaceful, abundant with wildlife, and usually pretty quiet in terms of human traffic, especially early mornings. I arrived at the lake around 6:45 in the morning. The sun was just coming up, creating that golden light that's perfect for spotting birds. I remember checking my watch and thinking I had timed it perfectly. I parked in the small gravel lot where the main trail begins, grabbed my binoculars, field guide and water bottle, and headed out. The moment I stepped onto the trail, something felt off. I can't explain it properly, but any birdwatcher knows that forests have a certain rhythm to them, especially in the morning. Birds calling, insects buzzing, the occasional rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. But that morning, there was nothing. Absolute silence. Not the peaceful kind of quiet you sometimes get in winter, but a heavy, unnatural stillness that made the hair on my arms stand up. I figured maybe it was just that specific spot, so I continued walking along the gravel path. I know this trail like the back of my hand. It loops around the lake for about 3 miles. Usually within the first few minutes, I'd have logged at least 5 or 6 different bird species in my notebook. That day, my notebook stayed empty. After walking for maybe 10 minutes, I stopped completely and just listened. No woodpeckers drumming on trees, no chickadees or cardinals calling, not even the sound of squirrels scampering through the leaf litter. Nothing. The silence was so complete, it felt like pressure against my eardrums. I decided to head toward a small clearing about half a mile in, where I often spot white-tailed deer in the early morning. As I got closer to that area, I noticed something else, a smell. And not just any smell, but something so distinctive and wrong that I actually covered my nose with my sleeve. It was musky and sour, like something rotting but not quite. Not like a dead animal or a skunk. Not like a wet dog or anything I could compare it to. It was just fundamentally wrong. The odor hung in the air like a fog, and it seemed to be coming from somewhere deeper in the trees, away from the path. I'm no stranger to forest smells. I've encountered everything from dead animals to all kinds of animal markings, but this was different. It made my stomach turn, but curiosity got the better of me. I stood there trying to figure out what could possibly create that smell when I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. About 100 yards ahead of me, a tree, a perfectly healthy-looking pine that must have been 30 or 40 feet tall, suddenly crashed to the ground. Not slowly, not with cracking or splintering, but all at once, like it had been pushed. There wasn't even a breeze that morning, let alone wind strong enough to topple a healthy tree. The sound echoed across the lake, somehow making the following silence even more profound. I stood frozen, staring at the fallen tree. In all my years of hiking and birdwatching, I've never seen a tree fall without cause. No storm, no visible rot, no beaver activity. Nothing. It just fell. And immediately after it did, I felt it. The sensation of being watched. Not just casually observed, but intensely scrutinized. Like whatever was watching me was focusing every ounce of its attention on me. The feeling was so powerful that I actually spun around, expecting to find someone standing right behind me. But the trail was empty in both directions. The sensation wasn't coming from the trail, though. It was coming from beyond the tree line, maybe 20 or 30 yards into the denser forest. I couldn't see anything through the thick undergrowth, but I knew with absolute certainty that something was there, watching me. The silence, the smell, the fallen tree, they all suddenly felt connected, like some kind of warning. I'd like to say I was brave enough to investigate, but that would be a lie. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave, not just leave, but run. I'm not typically someone who spooks easily. I've encountered black bears and wild boars while out hiking, and while those experiences were certainly tense, they never filled me with the kind of primal dread I felt at that moment. I tried to stay calm. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that there was a logical explanation for everything. Maybe the silence was due to a predator passing through earlier. Maybe the smell was some kind of fungus I wasn't familiar with. Maybe the tree had been damaged in a previous storm and just happened to fall at that moment. But I couldn't convince myself. Something was very wrong, and I needed to get out of there. I turned around and started walking back toward my car, trying not to move too quickly at first. I didn't want to trigger any predatory instinct if something was indeed watching me. But with every step, the feeling of being observed intensified, as if whatever it was had started following me, keeping pace just inside the tree line. The walk back to the car felt 10 times longer than the walk in. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The smell seemed to follow me, getting stronger and then fading, as if whatever was producing it was moving parallel to me through the woods. About 200 yards from the parking area, there's a small overlook point that gives you a wide view of the lake. I paused there briefly, partly to catch my breath and partly because I felt compelled to look across the water. That's when I heard it. From the opposite shore, maybe a quarter-mile away, came a howl. Not just any howl, but a sound so deep and resonant that I felt it more than heard it. It was long and drawn out, rising and falling in pitch. It wasn't a coyote or a dog. I've heard plenty of both. This sounded bigger, like it came from something with an enormous chest and lungs. It echoed across the water, bouncing back from the hills behind me. The howl repeated 3 or 4 times, each one making me feel smaller and more vulnerable. Then, just like that, the woods fell silent again. Dead silent. I didn't wait around to hear or see anything else. I practically ran the rest of the way to my car, fumbled with my keys, and locked the doors the instant I was inside. My hands were shaking so badly I had trouble getting the key in the ignition. As I drove away, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something emerge from the trees behind me. When I got home, I immediately looked up native wildlife in the area, trying to rationalize what I'd experienced. Could it have been a wolf? Not likely. Wolves aren't established in Mississippi. A coyote. The sound was too deep, too powerful. A bear. Black bears can make some pretty intimidating noises, but what I heard wasn't a bear. I was reluctant to tell anyone about what happened. Who would believe me? I heard a weird noise in the woods and got spooked. Sounds pretty ridiculous when said out loud, but it wasn't just the howl. It was the combination of everything. The unnatural silence, the putrid smell, the falling tree, the feeling of being watched, and then that sound. Together, they created an experience that I still can't explain. I've been back to Big Creek Lake since then, but only to the main recreation areas where there are always other people around. I haven't returned to that particular trail, and honestly, I don't think I ever will. Something was there that morning, something large, something aware of my presence, and something that wasn't entirely welcoming. I still go bird watching regularly, but now I always make sure to tell someone exactly where I'm going and when I'll be back. And I never go alone to remote areas anymore, no matter how familiar they might be. I don't know what was in those woods that day. All I know is that for a few terrifying minutes, I wasn't the observer anymore. I was being observed, and whatever was watching me wanted me to know it was there and that I wasn't welcome. Has anyone else experienced anything like this while out in the woods? I still can't shake the feeling that something was hunting me that day, and I only escaped because it allowed me to. Story 11. I've been sitting on this experience for almost 3 years now, and I still don't have a rational explanation for what I saw. I'm not the type who goes looking for the paranormal or believes every strange thing I see is a ghost or monster. I'm just a regular guy who commutes to work, pays his bills, and tries to live a normal life. But what I saw that evening in November of 2020 has forced me to question what I believe is possible. I work at a manufacturing plant about 40 minutes south of Akron, Ohio. My shift usually ends at 5:30, but that day I had stayed late to finish some paperwork. Nothing unusual, just routine stuff. It was almost 7 when I finally left, and it was already dark. The temperature had dropped into the low 30s, and there was that crisp feeling in the air that signals winter is coming. I was driving north on Greenwich Road, heading toward the I-76 interchange to get home. This is a route I've taken hundreds of times. It's mostly rural, lots of open fields, patches of woods, and a few scattered houses and farms. The area hasn't changed much in decades despite creeping development. There's still a wildness to it, especially once you get away from the main roads. About a mile before you reach the interstate, there's this huge fruit field on the right side of the road. It stretches maybe 300 yards from the road before it hits a tree line. I don't even know what they grow there. Apples, maybe, or some kind of berries. In November, it's just empty land with a few scraggly plants. I was tired and thinking about what I'd heat up for dinner when something caught my eye. At first, it was just movement, something crossing the field at a good clip. My headlights were illuminating part of the field closest to the road, but this thing was further back, maybe 200 yards from where I was driving. I probably wouldn't have noticed it, except that it was so damn white against the darkness. My first thought was that it might be a deer. We get plenty of those around here, and they're always crossing roads and fields. But even as that thought formed, I knew it wasn't right. This thing was walking upright on 2 legs, and it was big, really big. I slowed down instinctively, though I wasn't in any danger of hitting it. It was way too far off the road for that. As my car slowed, I got a better look. This wasn't someone in a white coat or a hunter in winter gear. The entire figure was covered in what looked like white hair or fur. Not patchy either, but completely covered. What struck me most was how it moved. If you've ever seen someone trying to run through a rough field, they usually stumble a bit, especially in the dark. This thing was moving with this fluid, purposeful. Stride that covered an insane amount of ground with each step. It was crossing from one patch of woods on the left side of the field to another on the right, and it moved like it knew exactly where it was going. I'm not great at judging distances, but I've spent enough time outdoors to have some sense of scale. Based on the trees at the edge of the field and how it looked against them, this thing had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe even 9. It wasn't just tall, but broad. Not fat, but solid and powerful looking. The whole sighting lasted maybe 6 or 7 seconds. I didn't stop my car. Something in my gut told me that was a bad idea. Instead, I watched it as long as I could while driving past. Its arms were swinging naturally as it walked, almost like a person's would, but with longer, more fluid movements. Just before it reached the tree line on the far side of the field, it seemed to pause for a split second. I swear it turned in my direction, though I couldn't make out any facial features at that distance in the dark. Then it stepped into the woods and was gone. I kept driving, but my mind was racing. What the hell did I just see? It was too big to be a person, way too big, and that white fur or hair covering it, that wasn't normal. The thought popped into my head almost against my will. Was that a Bigfoot? But I'd always heard Bigfoot was supposed to be dark-colored, not white. When I got home, I didn't tell anyone. What would I say? Hey, I think I saw some giant white furry humanoid crossing a field. I'd sound insane. So I kept it to myself, though I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept replaying those few seconds in my mind, trying to convince myself it was just a person in some weird costume, or maybe even a large piece of farm equipment that my tired mind had misinterpreted. But I knew better. I'd seen what I'd seen. For weeks afterward, I took the same route home, hoping to spot it again, but also kind of dreading the possibility. I even drove by, on weekends a few times in daylight, looking at that field and the surrounding woods. There was nothing unusual to see, just a normal agricultural field bordered by trees. The creek that runs behind those woods seemed like the kind of place something wild might travel along. But that was just speculation on my part. Months passed, and I started to doubt my own memory. Maybe I had been more tired than I realized. Maybe it was just someone in a weird costume playing a prank. I almost convinced myself it was nothing. Then, last summer, I was driving past that same spot with my wife. It was a bright Sunday afternoon, and we were heading to a garden center further up the road. As we passed the field, the memory came flooding back. I saw something weird here once, I said, almost without thinking. My wife glanced over at me. What kind of weird? I hesitated. We've been married for 12 years, and she knows I'm not the type to make up stories. Still, I was worried she'd think I was crazy. I saw something crossing that field one night after work. Something big and white, walking on 2 legs. I expected her to laugh, but she didn't. Instead, she looked out at the field with a strange expression. Like a person, she asked. No, I said. Much bigger than a person, and covered in white fur. At least, that's what it looked like from a distance. She was quiet for a moment. You think it was a Bigfoot or something? I shrugged. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't normal, whatever it was. The conversation moved on to other things, but the fact that I'd finally told someone made it real again. I couldn't stop thinking about it. A few weeks later, I was scrolling through a local news site when I came across an article about unexplained sightings in the rural areas around Akron. Curious, I clicked on it. Most of it was the usual stuff, strange lights in the sky, weird noises at night, but near the end, there was a paragraph that made my blood run cold. It mentioned that over the past 5 years, there had been 3 separate reports of a large, pale figure seen in the wooded areas south of Akron, particularly near the Styx River region, which is exactly where I'd had my sighting. One witness described it as at least 7 feet tall and completely white, like it was covered in snow. Another said it moved unnaturally fast for something so big. I must have read that paragraph a dozen times. These people had seen the same thing I had. I wasn't crazy. I started researching more, digging into local history and folklore. The Styx River area has been around since the 1800s, and despite development creeping in from all sides, it's still got large stretches that are pretty much wilderness. The creek that runs behind those woods, where I saw the thing, connects to the Styx River about a mile east. I found mentions in old newspaper archives of strange sightings in the area dating back decades, though nothing specifically about a white creature. Most were typical Bigfoot reports, large, dark, hairy humanoids, but the locations matched up with where I'd seen my white thing. I've driven past that spot hundreds of times since then, in daylight and darkness. I've never seen it again. But I find myself always looking, always watching that field and those woods, half hoping and half dreading that I'll catch another glimpse. Sometimes I wonder if I should report what I saw to one of those cryptid research groups. But I haven't, because I'm not sure I want to open that door. What if they want to interview me? What if my name gets out there as that guy who saw Bigfoot? I've got a normal life, a good job, friends and family who respect me. I don't want to be known as the local crackpot, but I know what I saw. It wasn't a person. It wasn't an animal. At least, not any animal known to science. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist, but apparently does. The thing that gets me the most is how purposeful it seemed. It wasn't wandering aimlessly or just passing through. It was heading somewhere specific, moving with intention, like it knew this land, like it had traveled this way many times before. That suggests it lives there, somewhere in those woods or along that creek. It has a territory, a home, which means it's probably still out there. I drive that route every workday. Sometimes, especially in winter when it gets dark early, I find myself scanning the field as I pass, wondering if I'll see that tall white figure again. I never have, but sometimes when I glance at those woods, I can't shake the feeling that something in there is watching me back. I don't know what that white thing was. I don't have a name for it. All I know is that it exists, and that knowledge has changed how I see the world. There are things out there we don't understand, things that defy explanation. And sometimes, if you're in the right place at the right time, or maybe the wrong place at the wrong time, you might catch a glimpse of them. I still don't talk about it much. But I know what I saw that November evening, crossing that field with those long, powerful strides. And no matter how much time passes, I'll never forget it. Story 12. I've been debating whether to post this for years. I guess I need to get it off my chest. And maybe someone here has experienced something similar. This all happened back in the summer of 1999, when I was living with my grandmother in Auburn, Washington. Our farmhouse was nice enough, nothing fancy, just a 2-story place with a decent yard that backed up to this swampy, wooded area. I'd grown up there, so the isolation never bothered me. The neighborhood was developed, but our property sat right at the edge, where civilization kind of gave way to wilderness. Looking back, there were always weird things happening at that house, but we never connected the dots. We'd hear these loud bangs against the walls at night, especially the back of the house. Not like someone knocking, more like something solid hitting the siding hard. My grandmother always said it was just branches falling or raccoons getting into stuff. I believed her because what else could it be, right? The summer of '99 was brutally hot, especially July and August. We'd keep the windows open at night to catch any breeze. That's when the smell would come. God, that smell. If you've ever smelled a skunk, take that and multiply it by 10, then add this weird, musky, rotten odor underneath. It would drift through the windows and literally wake us up. We'd have to close everything up and sweat through the night. Grandma always blamed skunks, but I'd smelled skunks before. This was different, more persistent, and way stronger. Then there was Grandma's garden. She took so much pride in those vegetables. She'd go out one morning and find tomatoes missing or half-eaten. Weird thing was, whatever was eating them wasn't leaving normal bite marks like you'd expect from deer or rabbits. The bites were larger, almost human-sized. And the walnuts. We had this old walnut tree, and sometimes we'd wake up to find walnuts scattered across the porch and yard in these strange patterns, almost like someone had deliberately arranged them. All of this was strange, but easy enough to brush off. We lived near the woods, so wildlife was always around. But what happened with Linda, our neighbor who lived 2 houses down, that was harder to explain away. It was probably mid-August when Linda called our house around 10 at night, absolutely hysterical. She was home alone and said something was standing at her back sliding door, watching her. She was so terrified she wouldn't go near the door, just kept saying, it's big, over and over. My grandmother told her to lock everything and that we'd be right over. When we got there, Linda was huddled in her living room with all the lights on. Whatever had been at, her door was gone, but she was still shaking. The next morning, Linda found a dead raccoon on her back porch. Not just dead, it looked like it had been deliberately placed there, laid out almost ceremonially. The weird part was when I asked her if it was an animal or a person at her door, she couldn't say. She just kept saying it was large and moved wrong. Not like any animal she'd ever seen, not like a person either. This is where things get more personal. My son was 4 at the time. We were sleeping downstairs that night because the upstairs bedrooms were like ovens in the summer heat. The downstairs guest room had these big windows that faced the porch and the swamp beyond. I remember it was a particularly hot night, must have been close to midnight, when my son shook me awake. "Mommy, something's looking at me," he whispered. I sat up fast, that maternal instinct kicking in hard. "What do you mean, baby?" "At the window. Something big is looking at me." I looked at the window, heart pounding, but didn't see anything. The porch light was off, and it was dark outside. I turned on the bedside lamp and checked the window again. Nothing there, but the curtains were moving slightly from the breeze coming through the partially open window. I closed and locked it immediately. "There's nothing there, honey. You were just having a bad dream," I told him, but I wasn't convinced myself. "It had big eyes," he said, curling up against me, "and it smelled bad." I couldn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept staring at that window, waiting for something to appear. Nothing did, but I couldn't shake the feeling we weren't alone. The next morning I found muddy prints on the porch, too big for a raccoon, too wide and oddly shaped for a person. My son never mentioned it again, and I didn't push him. Kids have nightmares, right? But here's the thing. 7 years later, I was browsing online, reading about local mysteries, and came across some Bigfoot sighting photos. I didn't believe in that stuff, but I was curious. My son walked by, glanced at my computer screen, and stopped dead in his tracks. "That's it," he said, pointing to one particular image. "That's what was looking at me that night." It wasn't like he was trying to be dramatic or making it up. He just matter-of-factly identified it and walked away, like it was no big deal. But my blood ran cold. My son wasn't a liar or prone to exaggeration. He simply recognized what he'd seen. After that night at my grandmother's, other things started happening. The banging on the house got louder and more frequent. Sometimes we'd hear what sounded like heavy footsteps on the porch, but when we'd check, nothing was there. The smell became almost constant during those hot August nights. One morning, I found all the bird feeders torn down and crushed, not knocked over, but literally crushed, like something had squeezed them in a powerful grip. And the garden? Something had trampled through it, leaving these huge, oddly shaped impressions in the soil. About a week after my son's nightmare, I was up late reading in the living room when I heard something moving around outside. Not small like a raccoon or possum, heavy steps, methodical. I froze, book in hand, listening. Then came this sound I'll never forget, a low, rumbling vocalization. Not quite a growl, almost like a person trying to mimic a bear, but wrong somehow. It went on for maybe 10 seconds before silence fell again. I didn't look outside. Something deep inside told me not to. I just turned off the light and sat in the dark, barely breathing, until sunrise. The next morning, I found 3 dead squirrels arranged in a triangle on the back porch. My grandmother finally called animal control, thinking we had a bear problem. The officer who came out looked around, found some hair caught on our fence, and said he'd never seen anything like it. Too coarse for bear, wrong color for deer. He took samples, but we never heard anything back. Linda moved away a month later, just packed up and left without even selling her house properly. I ran into her sister years later, who told me Linda refused to ever talk about why she left Auburn so suddenly. We stayed through the fall, but the activity seemed to die down as the weather cooled. By October, the banging stopped, the smell disappeared, and things returned to what passed for normal. We convinced ourselves it had just been a weird summer. In 2002, we moved to a town about 30 miles away. I hadn't thought about those events in years until I came across a local newspaper article from the 1950s describing similar experiences: strange smells, property damage, unidentifiable sounds, in an area not far from our new home. Reading those accounts sent chills down my spine because they matched our experiences almost exactly. The article mentioned large deer populations in the area, which got me thinking. Auburn and the surrounding areas have extensive wooded regions with wildlife corridors that run for miles. These corridors connect different forests and wilderness areas, allowing animals to move around relatively undetected, usually following tree lines and back roads. I started doing research, looking up other reports from the Auburn area. I found dozens spanning decades: strange noises, unexplained property damage, odd smells, and occasionally sightings of something large moving through the woods. Most people brush these off as bears or overactive imaginations, but after what we experienced, I'm not so sure. Could all those things, the banging, the awful smell, the garden damage, the walnuts, the dead raccoon at Linda's, what my son saw, have been connected to something living in those woods? Something that moves along those wildlife corridors, following the deer, staying hidden most of the time? I don't know what to call it. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, some undiscovered animal? Whatever it was intelligent enough to arrange those. Walnuts, place dead animals, and know when to retreat. It was strong enough to crush metal bird feeders and make those loud bangs against our house. And it was interested enough in us to peer through windows at sleeping children. The woods behind my grandmother's house are still there. The swamp has been partially drained for development, but large sections remain untouched. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, moving through the trees at night, watching the new families who've moved into the area. I've never told this story in full before. Most people would think I'm crazy or that I'm exaggerating normal wildlife encounters. Maybe they're right. But my son's immediate recognition of that creature in the photo, years after the fact, with no prompting from me, that's something I can't explain away. Whatever it was real. And sometimes late at night, when the windows are open and I catch a whiff of something foul on the breeze, I wonder if it's found me again. Story 13. I've been debating whether to share this for years now. Every time I start typing, I delete it all and walk away. But I need to get this off my chest. Maybe someone here has experienced something similar or can make sense of what happened to my wife and me that night at Salt Fork. This happened back in August of 2008. My wife Amelia and I had been living in Belmont for about 3 years at that point. We were both pretty avid anglers and would often go night fishing during the summer months when the heat wasn't so oppressive. That particular evening was beautiful, clear skies, nearly full moon, and not too humid for an Ohio August. We decided to head to Salt Fork State Park since we'd heard the catfish were biting well there. It's about a 45-minute drive from our place, and we arrived around 8:30 or 9 that evening. We specifically chose the spot where Whiskey Road meets the lake because it was somewhat secluded and we'd had good luck there before. The setup was perfect. There's this little clearing right by the water where you can park your car and fish right off the bank. We brought our usual gear, couple of folding chairs, tackle box, cooler with some beers and sandwiches, and our rods, of course. There were no other cars around, which wasn't unusual for a weeknight. By 10 o'clock, we'd caught 3 decent-sized catfish and were having a pretty good time. The moon was reflecting off the water, cicadas were buzzing in the trees behind us, and there was just enough breeze to keep the mosquitoes away. Amelia was sitting in her chair about 5 feet to my right, and we were talking about maybe heading home in another hour or so. That's when we heard it, the first scream. It was distant enough that we both paused our conversation, looked at each other, and then both said something like, "Did you hear that?" It sounded like a woman screaming, but not quite right. It's hard to explain, but it was higher pitched and longer than you'd expect from a human. My first thought was maybe it was a mountain lion or bobcat. They can sound eerily human-like. We brushed it off and went back to fishing. Then about 5 minutes later, we heard it again. Louder this time, closer. Amelia grabbed my arm and whispered, "Alan, what is that?" I tried to play it cool and suggested it was probably just an animal, but I was starting to feel uneasy. The sound was definitely coming from the woods behind us, in the direction opposite the lake. We waited, and sure enough, maybe 2 or 3 minutes later, there was another scream, even closer. This one made the hair on my arms stand up. It still had that woman-like quality to it, but there was something wrong about it. It was too powerful, too sustained, and it was definitely moving toward us. "I think we should pack up," Amelia said, already starting to reel in her line. I agreed and began gathering our things. We weren't panicking yet, but we were definitely moving with purpose. The fourth scream is what changed everything. It couldn't have been more than a couple 100 yards away at that point, and it had this, I don't know, hungry quality to it. That's the only word I can think of to describe it, like something was hunting. We started throwing our gear into the back of our car haphazardly. I didn't even bother properly stowing my fishing rod, just tossed the whole thing in the trunk. Amelia was whisper shouting at me to hurry up, and I could hear the fear in her voice. Then we heard branches breaking. At first, it was just a few snaps here and there, but then it turned into a continuous sound of underbrush being plowed through. Whatever was coming toward us was big, and it wasn't using any trail. It was coming straight through the woods. By this point, we were both scared shitless. I fumbled with the keys as I jumped into the driver's seat, and Amelia practically dove into the passenger side. She hadn't even closed her door all the way when I turned the key in the ignition. And that's when we saw it. Or rather, saw the effect of it. In the moonlight, I could make out trees actually moving, not just branches, but entire saplings bending and breaking. It was coming right at us, and it was moving fast. Another scream ripped through the night air, so close now it made my ears ring. Amelia was shouting, "Go, go, go!" and I floored it before her door was even fully closed. As we peeled out of that clearing, I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw something. I can't tell you exactly what it was because it was dark and I was focused on getting the hell out of there, but it was large, taller than a man, and it was moving on 2 legs. The moonlight only gave me a silhouette, but that was enough to know I never wanted to see it clearly. The worst part was that it followed us. I'm not talking about it watching us leave. This thing chased our car. Through the open passenger window, we could hear it screaming and the thundering of footfalls as it ran after us. Trees and brush were snapping like wet spaghetti as this thing barreled through the forest alongside the dirt road. I've never driven so fast on an unpaved road in my life. I was gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white, and Amelia was half turned in her seat, staring out the back window, sobbing and telling me it was still coming. The speedometer was pushing 35, then 40 miles per hour on this bumpy, winding dirt road, and this thing was keeping pace with us. Not right behind us, but off to the side in the woods, running parallel to the road. We could hear it even over the engine and the tires on gravel. It wasn't until we hit about 45 miles per hour that the sounds began to fade. I didn't slow down until we reached Route 1, where I made a hard left turn, then a right onto Route 22. We drove all the way home without stopping once, not even for the gas station bathroom that Amelia normally would have insisted on. When we got home, we sat in our driveway for a long time, not saying anything. Our fishing gear was scattered all over the back of the car, rods tangled, tackle box open with lures and hooks spilled everywhere. We'd left one of our chairs behind. We tried to talk about what happened, but we couldn't come up with any rational explanation. A bear wouldn't chase a car. A person couldn't run that fast through dense woods, and neither would make those sounds. I went online the next day and started researching. That's when I found out about the Bigfoot sightings at Salt Fork. I'd always thought those stories were bullshit, made up by attention seekers or confused people who saw a bear. Now I'm not so sure. Amelia and I made a pact never to go back to Salt Fork, and we've kept that promise. We still go fishing, but we stick to populated areas now, and we're always home before dark. It's been 15 years, and I still wake up sometimes, hearing those screams in my head. I still see those trees bending in the moonlight, and I still wonder what would have happened if my car hadn't started, or if we'd been just a little slower packing up. I don't know what chased us that night. I don't want to know, but I do know that there are things in this world that don't fit into the neat categories we've created. Things that shouldn't exist, but do. To this day, whenever someone suggests camping or night fishing in a secluded area, I come up with some excuse not to go. Amelia does the same. We never told our friends or family the full story because we know how it sounds. Who would believe us? But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And I know that something impossible chased our car through the woods that night at Salt Fork. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for the next person who stays out too late by the lake. And sometimes, on quiet nights, when the wind is just right, I think I can hear distant screaming, even though I know it's just my imagination. Or at least, I hope it is. Story 14. I still get cold chills thinking about what happened that day at J Lake. This was back in the winter of '94, when I was 15. People talk about life-changing moments, but they usually mean stuff like graduation or getting married. For me, it was a random Saturday in January that changed everything I thought I knew about the world. My buddy Chris and I were obsessed with ice fishing that winter. We'd saved up for decent gear and convinced our parents to drop us off at West Branch State Park whenever they could. We weren't exactly experts, but we knew enough to be safe on the ice, or so we thought. That particular day was brutally cold. Maybe 15 degrees with this wind that cut right through you. Most people stayed home, which was exactly why we wanted to go. Less people meant better fishing, at least in our teenage logic. My mom almost didn't let me go, worried about the weather forecast, but I begged until she gave in. If only she'd stuck to her guns. We had this little pond we liked about a half-mile hike from where Chris's dad dropped us off. It wasn't part of the main lake, more like a glorified puddle that hardly anyone bothered with. But we'd had decent luck there before, and it was sheltered from the wind by a thick line of trees on the far side. The ice was thick enough near the edges, probably 5 or 6 inches, but there was this weird unfrozen patch right in the middle. Not large, maybe 6 feet across, but definitely open water. We figured it must have been fed by an underground spring or something that kept it from freezing completely. We weren't stupid enough to walk near it, but we thought we could cast our lines into it from the safety of the solid ice. We'd been there maybe 30 or 40 minutes, not having much luck. My toes were going numb despite 2 pairs of socks, and Chris kept complaining about his fingers. We were just about ready to pack it up when I noticed something moving at the tree line across the pond. At first, I thought it was a deer. They were common enough, and the movement was partly hidden by some low-hanging pine branches. I nudged Chris and pointed, thinking it might be cool to see some wildlife. "You see that?" I whispered. Chris squinted across the pond. "By the big pine. Yeah, what is that?" Before I could answer, the what revealed itself, and everything inside me went still. A figure stood up from where it had been crouching at the edge of the trees, stood up and kept standing until it was tall, really tall. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. It wasn't a deer, wasn't a person in a winter coat. It was massive, with these unnaturally broad shoulders that tapered down to a narrower waist, and it was covered in hair, not wearing a fur coat, covered in dark, thick hair all over its body. I remember my mouth going completely dry as this thing started walking up the snow-covered hill behind the pond. It moved with this strange confidence, like the steep, snowy incline was nothing. No stumbling, no slipping, just this purposeful stride that ate up ground faster than seemed possible. "Marcus," Chris whispered, his voice cracking, "what the fuck is that?" I couldn't answer. My brain was running through possibilities, each one more impossible than the last. A bear walking on hind legs. In January, when they should be hibernating, a person in some kind of costume. In the middle of nowhere, in freezing temperatures, with no other tracks or people around. The thing reached the top of the hill, maybe 75 yards away from us, and then it stopped, and it turned, and it looked right at us. I'll never forget that moment as long as I live. There was this absolute certainty that it was studying us, seeing us as clearly as we saw it. The distance was too great to make out facial features, but I could feel its eyes locked onto us. The whole world seemed to go silent. No wind, no birds, nothing but the sound of my heart hammering in my ears. I don't know how long we stood there frozen like that, probably only a minute or two, but it felt like hours. This bizarre standoff where nobody moved. I remember thinking absurdly that I should wave or something, like this was just some hiker we'd encountered, but every instinct in my body was screaming that this was not a person, not anything that should exist in the woods of Ohio. It was Chris who broke first. He made this small, strangled sound in the back of his throat, and suddenly we were both moving, scrambling to grab our gear. We didn't speak, didn't need to. Pure animal panic took over. I remember dropping one of my favorite lures, watching it skitter across the ice, and not even considering going back for it. We ran, flat out ran through the snow, slipping and sliding, not even looking back to see if it was following us. The half-mile back to the main path felt like 10 miles. My lungs burned from the cold air, and I kept expecting to feel something grab me from behind at any second. We made it to the main park area, where a couple of cars were parked and collapsed on a bench, gasping for breath. An older guy walking his dog gave us a strange look, but kept moving. Did you see that?" Chris finally managed between breaths. I nodded, still unable to form words. What was it?" he asked, his face pale beneath his winter flush. "I don't know," I said, and I really didn't. Still don't, if I'm being honest. We debated telling someone, a park ranger, our parents, anybody. But what would we say? That we saw some giant hairy thing walking upright in the snow? Who would believe two teenagers? They'd assume we were pulling a prank, or had seen a bear, or a guy in a winter coat from a distance. But it wasn't any of those things. I know what bears look like. I know what people look like, even bundled up for winter. This was something else entirely. The ride home with Chris's dad was quiet. He asked if we caught anything, and we mumbled something about the fish not biting. I spent the whole ride staring out the window at the trees whipping past, wondering what else might be hiding out there. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure turning to look at us. I kept thinking about how it moved, so deliberate, so at home in conditions that would have most humans struggling, and the size of it. Standing on that hilltop, it looked almost 7 feet tall, with proportions that were just wrong. I tried researching at the school library the following week. This was before the internet was in every home, so I was flipping through books about Ohio wildlife, looking for anything that might explain what we saw. Nothing came close. I even looked up myths and legends, wondering if we'd somehow hallucinated something I'd read about before, but there was nothing specific to our area that matched. Chris and I talked about it obsessively for a few weeks, then gradually less and less. Not because we forgot, how could we? But because there was nothing new to say. We had no answers, no explanations, just this shared experience that didn't make any sense. We never went back to that pond. We tried ice fishing at other spots in West Branch that winter, but our hearts weren't in it anymore. Every crack of a branch or rustle in the underbrush would have us jumping and looking over our shoulders. By the next winter, we'd both found other hobbies, indoor hobbies. Over the years, I've told this story to exactly 3 people. My college roommate, who was convinced we'd seen a guy in a ghillie suit. Why someone would wear hunting camouflage in the dead of winter, he couldn't explain. A girlfriend who thought it was cute that I believed in Bigfoot. I broke up with her shortly after. And my wife, who didn't dismiss it but gently suggested that memories can be unreliable, especially childhood ones. But here's the thing. I don't think this memory is unreliable. It's one of the clearest memories I have from my teenage years. I can still picture exactly how that figure moved up the hill, how it stood at the top looking down at us, how utterly wrong it looked in that winter landscape. I've read accounts since then of similar sightings in Ohio and Pennsylvania. Some are obvious hoaxes, some are probably misidentifications, but a few sound exactly like what we saw that day. And those accounts make my skin crawl, because if other people have seen it too, then maybe. I'm 38 now with kids of my own. They're getting to the age where they want to go exploring, fishing, hiking, normal kid stuff. And I encourage it, I really do. But I always make sure they're not alone, and I've made it clear that certain areas of any park are off limits. My wife thinks I'm overprotective. Maybe I am. But sometimes when I'm driving past wooded areas in winter, I find myself scanning the tree lines, looking for movement, for something standing up that shouldn't be there. I've never seen anything like it again, and part of me hopes I never will. Yet there's another part, the part that's never stopped wondering, that almost wishes for one more glimpse, just to prove to myself that I didn't imagine it. That for one brief moment on a cold January day, Chris and I saw something that shouldn't exist walking through the Ohio woods, something that looked back at us and knew we were there. Whatever it was, it let us go that day. We ran, and it didn't follow. At least, not that we saw. But I've always wondered, what if we hadn't run? What if we'd stayed? Would it have come closer? Would it have revealed itself more clearly? Or would it have been the last thing we ever saw? I guess I'll never know. And maybe that's for the best. Story 15. I've always been fascinated by cryptids and supernatural stuff, but I never really believed any of it was real. Not until last September, anyway. I'm 16 now, but I was 15 when it happened. I want to write books someday, and I had this idea for a young adult novel about Sasquatch legends. My parents thought it was great I was doing research instead of just making stuff up, so when our neighbor mentioned knowing a tribal elder who led Sasquatch expeditions near Mount Hood, they actually let me go. Looking back, I probably should have been more scared about camping with strangers, but Mr. Redhawk, the elder, had taken groups out for years, and my neighbor vouched for him. Plus, my parents called him like 5 times before letting me go. I was mostly just excited to get some authentic material for my book. I arrived at Boundary Lake on a Friday afternoon in September. The weather was perfect, not too hot, not too cold. The lake sits in this valley, surrounded by dense forest in the foothills east of Mount Hood. It's pretty remote. You have to drive down this dirt road for like 40 minutes after turning off the highway, and there's no cell service once you're about halfway there. When I got to the meeting spot, there were 4 other people besides Mr. Redhawk. There was a couple in their 40s, Tom and Lisa, a guy in his 30s who introduced himself as a field researcher named Derek, and an older man named Bill, who must have been in his 70s. I nearly freaked out when Mr. Redhawk introduced him. Apparently, Bill was involved in that famous Sasquatch film from 1967 in Northern California. The film that everyone's seen. I'd watched it a million times while researching, and now I was standing right in front of someone who was actually there. We set up camp about 200 yards from the lake in a small clearing. I pitched my tent between Derek's and the couple's, while Mr. Redhawk and Bill set up on the other side of our campfire ring. After dinner, Mr. Redhawk suggested we take a night walk to introduce ourselves to the forest. I remember laughing a little, thinking it was just some spiritual nature stuff, but everyone else took it super seriously. As it got dark, we grabbed flashlights and headlamps. Mr. Redhawk told us to keep lights pointed down and to speak quietly. "We don't want to appear threatening," he said. "We're visitors in their territory." We walked maybe a half mile into the woods. It was so dark I could barely see the person in front of me. There was no moon that night, and the trees blocked what little starlight there was. Then Mr. Redhawk had us stop and turn off our lights. I've never experienced darkness like that. I literally couldn't see my hand in front of my face. We stood there in silence for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 minutes. That's when I heard it. A heavy thump from somewhere to our left, like something big had jumped from one spot to another. Then another thump. From the right side. It wasn't random forest noise, it was deliberate. I felt Derek tense up beside me. "We're not alone tonight," Mr. Redhawk whispered. I thought they were messing with me at first, like some initiation prank, but everyone was dead serious. Bill pulled out this night vision scope and scanned the area, then handed it to me. "Look over there, about 2 o'clock, behind that large pine," he whispered. I pointed the scope where he indicated and adjusted the focus. At first I just saw trees and brush. Then something moved. I swear I'm not making this up. I saw a tall, human-like figure peeking around a tree trunk. It was at least 7 feet tall, with a distinctly pointed head shape. Not like a cone, but like the top of its head came to a slight point. I only saw it for maybe 2 seconds before it pulled back behind the tree. My hands were shaking so bad, I almost dropped the scope. I tried to look again, but the thing suddenly went dark. I turned to Bill and whispered that it wasn't working. "Let me see," he said, taking it back. He looked through it and said, "Works fine for me." He passed it to Derek, who confirmed it was working perfectly. When I tried again, nothing but darkness. "They can do that," Mr. Redhawk said quietly. "Affect electronics. Cameras, phones, even night vision sometimes, especially with people they're interested in." The way he said it, "people they're interested in," made my skin crawl. We stayed out there for another hour, but I didn't see anything else. I kept hearing what sounded like heavy footsteps circling our position, always just out of sight. When we got back to camp, everyone was buzzing with excitement, talking about activity and Class A encounter, but I was just trying to process what I'd seen. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was another person from a different group, but who would be out there in the pitch dark without a light? I was exhausted but too wired to sleep, so I wrote some notes in my journal before finally crawling into my sleeping bag around midnight. I just started to drift off when I felt something poke the bottom of my tent, right where my feet were. It wasn't aggressive, more like someone curiously poking with a finger. I froze, thinking maybe it was a raccoon or something. Then it happened again, more deliberately. Whatever it was pressed against the tent fabric hard enough that I could feel it through my sleeping bag. I sat up and whispered, "Hello?" Stupid, I know, but I was half asleep and scared. The poking stopped immediately. I heard what sounded like breathing just outside my tent, not animal breathing, but slow, controlled, human-like breathing. I was too terrified to move or call out to the others. After what felt like forever, I heard soft footsteps moving away from my tent. I must have eventually fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember is waking up to the feeling of being pulled. It's hard to explain, but it felt like something was pulling my sleeping bag backward toward the tent wall. I wasn't dreaming. I physically felt myself sliding a few inches. I yelled and scrambled out of my sleeping bag, fumbling for my flashlight. By the time I got it on, nothing was there. My sleeping bag was definitely not where I'd left it, though. The bottom part was pushed up against the back wall of the tent. I checked my watch. 4:30 in the morning. I didn't sleep after that. I just sat there with my flashlight on until I saw daylight filtering through the tent fabric. When I finally crawled out around 6, Tom was already up making coffee. "Rough night?" he asked, looking at my face. I must have looked terrible. I told him what happened, expecting him to laugh it off or tell me I was dreaming. Instead, he nodded seriously. "Lisa saw something weird around 4:30, he said. "She woke me up because there were these red orbs floating near the camp. Like glowing red eyes, but they were moving independently, not like they were attached to anything, and we both heard what sounded like children giggling. That detail, the time matching exactly when I felt pulled, made it impossible to write off as coincidence. Mr. Redhawk joined us at the fire. Before going to bed the night before, he'd placed some offerings at the edge of our campsite, wildflowers, shiny coins, and some tobacco. When he went to check on them, he found they'd been rearranged in a perfect circle, with the coins stacked in the center. As everyone else woke up, we shared our experiences from the night. Derek had recorded strange knocking sounds on his audio equipment. Bill hadn't experienced anything unusual, but he wasn't surprised by our stories. "They're curious about newcomers," he explained, looking at me, "especially young ones. They seem drawn to children and teenagers more than adults." After breakfast, we hiked around the lake. Everything seemed normal until we stopped for water about 2 miles in. We were all sitting there when we heard a crow call overhead, and then, I swear this happened, a rock about the size of a baseball rolled into our circle. Not fell, rolled, like someone had pushed it toward us. Derek picked it up and showed it to Mr. Redhawk, who examined it closely before placing it in his backpack. "A gift," he said simply. That afternoon, we found something I still can't explain. About a mile from our campsite, deep in the woods, was this massive structure made of trees. Not fallen trees. These were 20-foot trees that had been uprooted and arranged in a teepee formation. The trunks were driven into the ground, with the tops leaning together. Some of these trees must have weighed hundreds of pounds. No human could have built this without heavy machinery, and there was no way to get equipment that deep in the forest. On our way back to camp, we walked along the lakeshore where there was a stretch of muddy beach. That's where we saw the footprints, hundreds of them, coming out of the water and disappearing into the forest. They were enormous, easily 16 inches long, with clear toe impressions. They weren't bear tracks, they looked like gigantic human feet. That night around the campfire, Mr. Redhawk told us about the local legends. The tribes in the area had always known about the forest people who lived in the Mount Hood wilderness. He said some reached heights of 9 or 10 feet, and they traveled in family groups. They were highly intelligent and had abilities beyond what humans could understand. I noticed that neither Mr. Redhawk nor Bill shared their personal experiences with these creatures. When I asked, Mr. Redhawk just said, "Some things are private. Some encounters change you in ways you can't explain to others." Nothing happened that second night, at least not to me. It was like whatever was out there had satisfied its curiosity. I went home the next day with a notebook full of observations and a mind full of questions. I haven't written that novel yet. Somehow it doesn't seem right to turn what I experienced into fiction. What I saw at Boundary Lake wasn't a legend or a myth. I don't know exactly what it was, but it was real. Those footprints were real. That structure was real. That figure I saw through the night vision scope was real. I've told this story to a few close friends, but most people just think I'm making it up, or that the group was playing an elaborate prank on me. Maybe that would be easier to believe, but I know what I experienced. The strangest part? I've been invited back this summer. Mr. Redhawk called my parents last week and said the forest people had asked about me. How he knows that, I have no idea. My parents think it's cute that the research group wants me to return, but they don't understand what it really means. I haven't decided if I'm going back. Part of me is terrified, but another part is desperate to understand what I encountered out there. Whatever those creatures are, they're real. And for some reason, they noticed me. Story 16. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened that day. It's been 3 months now, but I can't shake it. Every time I close my eyes at night, I see those 2 pine trees and whatever that thing was standing between them. It was the 2nd Saturday of January this year. Chris and I had planned this hunting trip for weeks, nothing major, just a day trip south of Longview to try our luck with whitetails. Chris had gotten a new scope for Christmas he was dying to try out, and I needed the break from work. The forecast called for clear skies, and despite the deep snow, we figured we'd at least get some fresh air if nothing else. We left Calgary around 5 in the morning while it was still dark. My old Ford F-150 handled the main roads fine, but once we turned onto the back roads, it was slow going. Chris kept complaining about my driving, but 2 feet of snow isn't something you rush through, especially on these unmaintained roads. The hunting itself was a complete bust. We spent hours trudging through snow up to our thighs, saw nothing but a couple of ravens, and by early afternoon we were cold, tired, and honestly a bit pissy with each other. That's how hunting goes sometimes. You come home empty-handed more often than not. Around 3:30, we decided to call it quits and head back. The sun was already getting low. Those short winter days don't give you much time. We packed up our gear, cranked the heater in the truck, and started the drive back to Calgary. I remember Chris was going on about how his brother-in-law always gets a deer on his first day out, and how we should have gone to his spot instead. I was only half listening, concentrating on the road. We were on this narrow, winding back road the locals call Indigenous Graves. I've never known if that's the official name or just what people call it, but it's always given me an uneasy feeling. It cuts through some of the most isolated terrain in the foothills, miles of nothing but trees, hills, and snow in winter. We hadn't seen another vehicle all day. The road follows this gentle curve around a hill that rises maybe 100 feet or so on the right side. The base of the hill has a thick tree line, but the slope itself is mostly open except for these 2 lone pine trees at the very top. They've always stood out to me, 2 perfectly symmetrical trees on an otherwise bare hilltop. I was just rounding that curve, probably doing about 20 miles per hour, when Chris suddenly sits up straight and says, "What is that thing up there?" Not in a curious way, but in this dead serious tone that immediately made my stomach drop. When someone talks like that, you know something's off. I followed his gaze up to the hill. Between those 2 pine trees was something large and black. My first thought was maybe it was a dark stump or deadfall I hadn't noticed before, but I've driven this road dozens of times. Then I thought, okay, moose. Had to be a moose. But as soon as my brain tried to process what I was seeing, I knew it wasn't a moose. It was standing on 2 legs for one thing, and the shape was all wrong. Without really thinking, I slowed the truck and pulled toward the shoulder to get a better look. That's when it moved. God, the way it moved. I've never seen anything, animal, human, anything move like that. It went from standing completely still between those trees to covering about 100 meters down the hillside in maybe 3 seconds flat. 3 seconds. Through snow that I know for a fact was at least 6 feet deep in drifts. It wasn't running like a person runs. It wasn't bounding like a deer. It was like it was gliding over the surface, but with these powerful, impossibly long strides. No struggling, no sinking into the snow, just this fluid, terrifyingly fast movement. When it reached the tree line at the bottom of the hill, it stopped. It didn't disappear into the trees immediately. It stood there, partially visible, shifting its weight from side to side, like it was watching us or deciding what to do next. This went on for maybe a minute, though it felt like an eternity. Even at that distance, I could tell it was tall, taller than any man I've ever seen. It was bulky too, not skinny, with broad shoulders. The color was the darkest black I've ever seen, or maybe a very dark brown. It almost seemed to absorb the light around it. I couldn't make out any facial features or details, just this imposing, massive silhouette. After what seemed like forever, it stepped back and disappeared into the forest, just melted away between the trees. Chris and I sat there in complete silence. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I couldn't feel my legs. I remember the heater was blasting, but I felt ice cold. Finally, Chris whispered, "What the fuck was that?" His voice was shaking. "I don't know," was all I could manage. "I really don't know." We started talking over each other then, trying to make sense of it. "Did you see how fast it moved? It was on two legs, right? Nothing can move through snow that deep that quickly. Not a person, no way. Not even with snowshoes. I've been hunting these woods since I was a teenager. I know what bears look like, what moose look like, what elk look like. This wasn't any of those. Bears don't stand upright and run like that. Moose don't have that silhouette. And no human being could have moved that fast through deep snow. It's physically impossible. After about 5 minutes of sitting there, I put the truck back in drive and we continued on. Neither of us suggested stopping or getting out to investigate, and looking back, I'm incredibly grateful for that. Something in my gut told me that would have been a terrible idea. We didn't talk much for the next few miles. Then Chris said something that made my blood run cold. "Remember those stories my grandfather used to tell about the dark ones in the woods?" Chris's grandfather was indigenous, from one of the local First Nations. He used to tell us stories when we were kids about spirits and creatures that lived in these mountains. At the time, I thought they were just scary campfire tales to keep children from wandering off into the forest alone. "You don't actually think," I started. "I don't know what to think," Chris cut me off. "But whatever that was, it wasn't natural." On our way back, we passed by the same spot again. I slowed down, and we both scanned the hillside and the tree line. There was nothing there, no tracks, no movement, no sign that anything had disturbed the snow at all. Those two pine trees stood silent at the top of the hill, the space between them empty now. The rest of the drive home was tense. We tried to rationalize what we'd seen. Maybe it was a guy in a snowsuit. Maybe it was a shadow or trick of the light. Maybe we were both tired and seeing things, but we both knew better. We'd both seen it clearly. Whatever it was, it had been real. When I dropped Chris off at his place, he hesitated before getting out of the truck. "You gonna tell anyone about this?" he asked. I thought about it for a second. "Who would believe us?" He nodded. "Yeah, I'll see you Monday." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying those few seconds in my head, the massive black figure, the impossible speed, the way it seemed to watch us from the trees. I've tried researching online to see if anyone else has reported something similar in the area. Nothing exact, but there are stories from hunters and hikers about strange encounters in those woods. Most people chalk them up to known wildlife or overactive imaginations. Chris and I have only talked about it a couple of times since then. He's as disturbed by it as I am. Last week, he told me he hasn't been sleeping well either. I haven't been back to Indigenous Graves Road since that day, and I don't plan to go hunting there again. Certainly not alone. I used to feel at home in those woods. Now, I can't shake the feeling that something's out there, something that shouldn't exist, something that watches from between the trees. I don't know what we saw that day. A cryptid, a spirit, something else entirely. All I know is that it moved in a way nothing natural should be able to move. And when I picture those two pine trees on that hilltop now, I can't help but imagine that space between them isn't really empty at all. Sometimes I still catch myself scanning the tree lines when I'm driving through rural areas, half expecting to see that dark shape watching me. And I wonder, If it could move that fast through deep snow, how quickly could it have reached our truck if it had wanted to?